Worthing. Prologue. An old woman toddled up the freezing aisle, a glorious Christmas cactus clutched in one gnarled hand, a knotty hazel walking stick grasped in the other. From the pulpit, the equally ancient vicar smiled benignly at her as she placed it on an old crumbling window shelf, and felt himself shiver in his robes. In spite of global warming, it was an unusually viciously cold and frosty morning, and the church felt like a freezer. Overhead, the church bells pealed, echoing sharply across the rural Oxfordshire valley. It was the last Sunday before Christmas, and perhaps because of that, the church actually had a few worshippers in it for a change. Two old men, bachelor twins of the parish, coughed and sneezed in the front row, victims of the latest flu virus, and the vicar sighed in sympathy. He now had 3 other churches to cover in his extended parish, and actual snow was forecast. It was many years since this part of the country had seen any significant snowfall, and the man of the cloth, to be frank, could have done without it. Ah well, the children loved it so. Reverend Adam Clode had come to the parish of Westcott Barton just over 40 years ago, a small village in the heart of Oxfordshire. It had undergone the usual changes over that period of time. It had seen 2 cul-de-sacs of council houses built on a patch of wasteland, and had lost the village school and post office. And of course, the rise in house prices had forced out many of the long-standing families, as incomers with money bought up the homes needed by the local youngsters. For all that, it still remained a largely close-knit farming community. The vicar watched as several young boys dashed in, looking irreverent but carrying great boughs of holly. The vicar winced at the sight of the roughly broken stalks, and gave up a brief prayer that the children had combed the woods for them and not raided the gardens of any of his parishioners. He met the eyes of the richest farmer in the county, Stanley Kelton, beneath their fiercely bushy brows, and quickly looked away. He prayed even harder that the boys had not wandered into Kelton woods for the holly. If Stanley now came across denuded holly bushes on his land, he would soon be back to church, but not for morning worship. Adam Clode could almost hear the farmer's imagined but withering tirade now. By his side, Stanley's daughter Delia sighed in boredom, her 2 brothers staring absently at the hymn numbers on the wall. Given the choice, the vicar knew that none of the Kelton offspring would come to church at all. Like the rest of the country nowadays, he suspected they were, at best, indifferent, if not downright atheists. But Stanley Kelton must have insisted, and what Stanley Kelton wanted, Stanley Kelton got. A moment later, the vicar found himself meeting the very different gaze of Sidney Kelton, Stanley's older brother. His blue eyes were gentle, and when he smiled at the vicar, almost as if he could read that reverend gentleman's unease and wanted to offer some comfort, Adam smiled back automatically, feeling unaccountably better. Mrs. Jarvis, the Kelton's cleaner, and a longtime member of the church's unofficial caretaking committee, carefully lit the long white candles. Their flames flickered quickly, casting shadows across the 16th century walls. Soon the smell of candle wax scented the air, and the holly, now placed along the alcoves by one of the sneezing bachelor twins, glinted in dark green glory. The bells continued to peal joyfully and echo across the crisp air, and suddenly, without warning, the real spirit of Christmas seemed to settle magically over the church and its tiny congregation. In these times of commercialization and overhyped advertising urging you to spend, Westcott Barton, for a few minutes at least, seemed to retain a little of the spirit of Christmas past. The old vicar straightened up as his arthritis was forgotten, and the bitterly cold air in the church became irrelevant, and looked down at the pinched, cold, white faces and red noses of his congregation. They waited for the sermon with patient resignation. Impulsively, The vicar reached for his songbook and called out for the carol, "God rest ye merry gentlemen," and the congregation caught the mood in an instant. The organist, nodding and shivering over the battered organ, sprang into life, like the enthusiastic schoolteacher that he was, and voices, hoarse with colds, out of tune but gutsy, rang around the church. It was the Sunday before Christmas. There was going to be snow for the children, mulled wine for the adults, and a rousing carol to lift the heart. The season of peace and goodwill was truly upon them. And yet, in the seemingly blameless congregation, amid the holly and the singing, silently, carefully, purposefully, someone was plotting cold-blooded murder. Chapter 1. The bone-shaking tractor pulled to a somewhat coughing halt as the driver peered out of his snow-frosted side window. "There's the road to Westcott Barton, missus. Not much of one, is it? And I doubt it'll be cleared any time soon, either. Think you can manage it? I'd offer to take you down there. I've promised a small holder in the next village I'll help him move his sheep before it gets dark." By his side, perched precariously and distinctly uncomfortably on a rusted wheel arch, an impressively Juno-esque woman with beautiful blue eyes squinted through the glass. As the farmer had said, the lane wouldn't be much of a thoroughfare, even in good weather. A single track, it was hemmed in on all sides by straggling blackthorns, and burdened with a recent and spectacular snowfall of nearly 2 feet. It resembled nothing so much as an obstacle course. Jenny Starling, traveling cook, sighed deeply, hefted her holdall past the rear of the driver's seat, and half rose. The farmer, a middle-aged man with a hooked nose and curious eyes, took one appreciative glance at her generous curves, and decided she would most definitely need a helping hand down. He quickly opened his door and slid out, sinking into a snowdrift which came over the top of his Wellingtons and promptly turned his shins numb. He cursed mildly, but watched with bemused respect as the attractive 20-something woman climbed out of the cramped tractor with unexpected ease and grace. Her coat was a bulky padded blue, matching the knitted bobble hat that hid a glossy array of dark brown curls. On her feet was sturdy leather boots that sensibly fitted far more snugly than his own Wellingtons. She was already hoisting her holdall down after her before the farmer could offer to reach up for it, and he had been about to offer. Although he'd come across his unexpected and unusual hitchhiker on a deserted winter road, and his mother had always maintained that only riffraff thumbed rides, there had been something about the woman that had instantly screamed class at him. In fact, Jenny usually traveled everywhere in her trusted cherry-red catering van, but not even her gallant and stalwart steed would have been able to handle the snow-packed roads, so she'd been forced, very reluctantly, to leave it undercover in a long-term car park not far from Burford. Unfortunately, all the local buses had been cancelled due to the previous day's snowstorm, leaving her with no other choice but to hoof it, unless she wanted to let her clients down, which she most definitely didn't. Jenny had her reputation for reliability to maintain. Luckily, she hadn't gone far when the tractor had rumbled up behind her, and she'd raised a hopeful thumb. Neither farmer watched her as she negotiated around the snowdrifts and stood by a drunkenly leaning signpost, rubbing her gloved hands briskly together for some much-needed warmth in the crisp morning air. England hadn't had a really bad winter to speak of for some time, and Jenny hoped the snow would soon go. Still, she couldn't help but be thrilled by the sudden blanket of white that had descended on the countryside. Everywhere children were tobogganing, making snowmen, and laying in ambush for the postman with a stock of snowballs. At first, it had made her feel like singing Winter Wonderland over and over again, until the novelty of it all wore off, that is. The thing was, she'd forgotten how damned inconvenient snow could be. Ivy grew darkly in the hedgerows around her, and by the side of the road, Mysterious animal tracks dotted the snow. She could see the unmistakable track of a fox, the paw prints placed in a single straight line, and the light feathery tail of his brush, where it had dragged along the ground. Any number of birds had left little clawed trails, but nothing much moved now. Only a single crow overhead, cawing raucously as it headed for a bare sycamore. Her eyes turned, the only sign of habitation for miles around, and roved thoughtfully over the rooftops and chimneys of the village that nestled about a mile down in the valley. "It's not actually the village itself I want, but Kelton Farm. Do you know it?" she asked, turning back to the farmer, thankful that there was no wind to drop the temperature even further. At the mention of the farm, however, the tractor driver visibly stiffened. His eyes, which had been both speculative and friendly, suddenly turned hostile. Despite the all-pervading freezing cold, Jenny felt the temperature drop yet another notch, and her heart fell. "Sure, I know it. You want to take this lane for half a mile or so, and then take the first path on the left, if you can see it in all this." He waved his hand at the blanketing snow. "I doubt old man Kelton has had the track cleared just to make life easier for visitors' mind. He would have better use for the few tractors he's got, I reckon, and he certainly wouldn't want to get his precious cart horses out just for that." There was unmistakable contempt in his tone now, and Jenny arched one eyebrow delicately into her fringe of dark hair. "Horses?" she almost squeaked in surprise. "You mean proper cart horses?" she asked quietly, feeling a thrill of romanticism ripple through her. "That's right," he snorted. "He uses mostly horses and charges a fortune for folks to come and watch what he calls traditional farming being done. He gets all sorts out here, school trips and tourists and whatnot, and all of them paying good money for the privilege. He sells his produce to them organic people who go crazy for it. Plus he rakes off all the grants he can get from the government for being so green. That's not to mention the half-baked hippies who pay a fortune to live in his run-down cottages and get a taste of the real thing. They think because they have to pump water out of a well by hand and live by gas lamps and candlelight that they're experiencing something special. Truth is, the county old sod doesn't have to pay for the upkeep or maintenance of the cottages, and he can still make a tidy profit out of them. But surely in this day and age he has to meet certain standards," Jenny objected. Her knight of the road snorted disdainfully. "Not him. Besides, nobody complains, do they? Like I said, they think they're getting a taste of the good old days, growing their own veg and raising rabbits or whatever. He even set up a fancy petting zoo for kitties in the summer. Charges nearly £5 for entry. Can you believe it? £5 Jenny shrugged, wondering if it was just jealousy talking. Nowadays she knew that many farmers had to subsidize their incomes. Maybe Stanley Kelton was one of those wise and heartwarming souls who bred rare species in an effort to save them from extinction. She knew a lot of the UK's oldest and more rural breeds of farming animals were in danger of dying out, in which case he would need the extra capital for their upkeep. You ask me, he likes to think he's some kind of lord of the manor still living in Victorian times. And what's to stop him? He's got all his family too scared to stand up to him. And Kelton Farm's the biggest around here," the farmer finally admitted, grudging every syllable. "His farmhands have got no choice but to play along with him. If they want to work, that is. Even though it's bloody back-breaking work doing things the old-fashioned way. You ask me, he's just too tight-fisted to pay good money on modern equipment. There's a saying around here, you can always trust a Kelton to get blood out of a stone." And he gave a gurgling laugh. Jenny sighed deeply. It was going to be one of those Christmases. She could just feel it. The farmer, noting her gloom, and unable to contain his curiosity any longer, gave an artificial cough. "You were going to work there yourself, then?" Jenny smiled rather grimly. "I'm afraid so, but just for the 2 weeks over Christmas. I'm their cook." "Their cook?" the farmer echoed, too stunned to remember his good manners. When he found those disconcertingly lovely blue eyes centered on him once more, he felt himself blush. At 42, it was something he hadn't done since his teen years. "Sorry, missus. It's just that it's not like Stan to hire somebody he didn't have to. Not when he's got a daughter to do all the drudgery and cooking for him." A glint of mischievous glee suddenly lightened his dour face. "Oh, I get it. Joanne, that's my wife. She told me that she'd heard young Delia was threatening to stop work over the Christmas season. Looks like she got up the gumption to stick by it too. Good on her, I say. But I said to Joe at the time, I couldn't see Stan going without his mince pies and turkey." Crow's feet appeared at the corners of his eyes as he grinned at some private or local joke that Jenny fervently hoped wasn't going to backfire on her. Whatever the family tensions were at Kelton Farm, the last thing she wanted to do was stand on anybody's toes. She sighed again, more deeply than ever. Yes, it was definitely going to be one of those Christmases. "Well, I suppose I'd better be off," she muttered, never one to falter in the face of adversity. She glanced at the leaden skies all around her and frowned. "There's more snow up there," she added quietly, her words rousing the farmer from his musings. "I reckon you're right there," he agreed briskly. "You mind them ditches then. Stick to the middle of the road," he advised, climbing back into the cabin of his shuddering tractor and continuing on down the road with a blithe wave of farewell in her direction. Jenny looked all around her at the snow and sighed. Wonderful. How was she to tell what was the middle of the road amongst all this blanketing whiteness? She gave a mental shrug and hoisted her tough nylon holdall firmly over one shoulder and set off. If she suddenly found herself knee-high in a foot or so of frozen water, she supposed that she could safely assume she'd come across a ditch. It was Christmas Eve tomorrow, and who knew what sort of welcome awaited her at her new place of work. Still, things could be worse, she told herself philosophically. At least she had a job. Well, the next 2 weeks at any rate. She'd been staying in Oxford, where she was hoping to secure a position in one of the many college kitchens once the next term started. Although she'd secured a little bedsit near Keble College, her kitchen in the converted Victorian house consisted of a single gas ring, and the thought of spending Christmas alone had been a depressing one. Her father still in France, and her activist mother off on some crusade or other about Christmas trees. So when she'd seen the 2-week job as cook at Kelton Farm advertised in the local paper, it had roused her interest immediately. Not even the derisory wages on offer had put her off. She cooked for the love of it, as well as for money, and the thought of spending a good old traditional Christmas on an English farm, cooking all those good old traditional dishes, seemed almost too good to be true. Now, as she trudged her way through the snowdrifts, she told herself that the next time mawkish sentiment reared its seductive head, she'd look the other way. Stan Kelton hardly sounded like a maiden's dream of an employer, and a rebellious daughter could cause her no end of problems. She only hoped there'd be no funny business this time. Through no fault of her own, she had, in the past, had to sort out some very nasty murders. People nowadays had no self-control, she thought crossly. After a while, she stopped walking, both to catch her breath and because something else had caught her attention. To her left, 2 rows of wooden stakes, standing a few feet apart and about a foot above the ground, led off over the crest of a hill. She put her holdall down and looked back down the road thinking, had she come half a mile? Straight on, the tower of the village church certainly looked closer, and that row of posts signified to her a set of fences running alongside a road. And, looking more closely still, the snow there did seem to be a few inches lower than the surrounding mats, as if a few days ago someone or something had passed along flattening the first layer of snow tight. The new snowfall, however, looked ominously pristine. "Oh, wonderful," Jenny muttered. Above her a flock of jackdaws rose noisily from a bare oak tree, scuffling and arguing. For a moment she watched them, envying their ease of movement as they set off towards the village. Then, with a somewhat self-pitying sigh, she resumed her trudging. She only hoped the farm was just over the hill. Snow looked pretty, but it was hard going on the legs. Her calf muscles were already begging for mercy, and her toes had long since said bye-bye to the rest of her. But if the farm turned out to be 3 or 4 miles over the hill, she thought resentfully, "I hope someone finds my frozen body and gives me a decent burial." A lone jackdaw came to roost on one of the posts and called out a cheery greeting to her as she went past. "Jack." "Oh, shut up," Jenny snarled at it and hefted her holdall just a little higher under her armpit. Since there'd been no telephone number attached to the advertisement, she'd written a letter citing her previous experience on employers and had been accepted by return of post. In that letter, Mr. Stanley Kelton had specified this morning as her time of arrival. The least he could have done was have one of his horses plow a path up this blasted track, she thought, feeling more and more put upon with every plodding step. At last, she crested the small rise and looked down, thankfully, onto a large, square, Cotswold stone farmhouse spread out below her. Although it was nearly 11 o'clock in the morning, the sky was so overcast it felt almost dark. In several windows, orange light spilled cheerfully onto the snowy courtyard surrounding it. From the set of stables off to the left, and attached to the house by a makeshift corrugated iron passageway, she could see steam gently rising into the air, although no horse, very wisely, hung his head over the half-doors into the frigid air beyond. As she looked, a black and white shape trotted across the cleared courtyard and scratched at the door to the house. The sheepdog was evidently out of luck, for as the cook thankfully picked up a little speed, the prospect of hot tea and an even hotter kitchen fire spurring her on, the dog trotted back disconsolately and disappeared into one of the stables. There, at least, the body heat of the animals would help to raise the temperature a little. She was out of breath, but in a much happier frame of mind, when she finally reached the door and banged on it sharply. At the sound, the sheepdog sped across the yard and comically skidded to a halt at the sight of a stranger in his domain. Guiltily, not to mention rather belatedly, he started to bark. Jenny glanced at him, not in the least intimidated. "Shut up, Pooch," a young and attractive voice said right in her left ear, and Jenny quickly turned around. "Hello, are you Miss Kelton?" she asked with a bright smile. She believed in making a good first impression. "Yes." Delia Kelton looked to be about 18 or so. She had shoulder-length blonde hair, the color of ripening wheat, and deep chocolate-brown eyes. She was in a red woolen dress that was well worn and far too small for her. The effect showed off too much leg and pulled too tightly across her rather well-developed breasts. No doubt her strike over Christmas was probably the least of her father's worries, Jenny thought wryly. "I'm Jenny Starling," Jenny said to no effect. "I'm the cook." Still no reaction. Delia continued to look at her, a puzzled frown pulling at her brows. "Mr. Kelton has hired me for 2 weeks to help out with the Christmas dinner and so on," she trailed off, dismayed to see a look of petulant fury fill the girl's otherwise pretty face. It was at once obvious that her father had not told her what he'd done. No doubt, Jenny thought with intuitive accuracy, Delia had hoped that her threat to stop work over Christmas was going to win her some concession or other, and Jenny's untimely arrival was living proof that she had failed. "Oh, hell," Jenny said glumly. Delia glanced at her sharply, her eyes narrowing. "You'd better come in," she said at last grudgingly. and as the unexpected visitor passed by, her well-padded figure such a striking contrast to her own slim frame, Delia frowned. She had the uncanny feeling that the other woman had understood far more than she should have done, just from a few simple words. It left her feeling oddly vulnerable and wrong-footed. "I suppose I'd better show you to the kitchen then," she said, with more hostility than she'd meant. "I dare say you're cold after that walk," she added quickly, by way of shamefaced recompense. Jenny nodded gratefully and followed her hostess into the most pitiful kitchen it had ever been her misfortune to come across. Although the room itself was perfectly adequate, large, square, and well-equipped, everything else was a sight. The floor was a picture of muddy footsteps thawing into little pools of water. Obviously, the men of the heist just tramped through with muddy, snow-covered Wellingtons whenever they pleased. The fire in the Argo was low and untended. The sink was full of unwashed dishes. On the table were a few crusts of bread and a piece of uncovered, hard-looking cheese. No kettle boiled, no smell of delicious baking permeated the air. And surely, she glanced at her watch. Yes, it was now almost 11:30. Wouldn't the men be coming in for their lunch soon? In weather like this, they'd need something hot. Delia watched the stranger's eyes narrow. Jenny quickly pulled off her bubble hat, revealing a cascade of surprisingly pretty, glossy dark hair. When the big cook looked once more her way, Delia found herself looking into piercing blue eyes that seemed to cut right through her. Jenny didn't say a word. She didn't have to. "I've refused to have anything to do with the place," Delia said, instantly on the defensive. "I told Father so, but he thought I was bluffing. Well, he knows differently now." Her chin angled up as her voice rose into semi-hysterical defiance. Still, Jenny made no comment, but she wearily shrugged off her coat. Beneath it, she wore a heavy, ivory-colored woolen sweater and a longish brown skirt. Her ample but sexy hourglass shape made the girl's eyes widen. "How long is it since the men have eaten a cooked meal?" she asked briskly, instantly the consummate professional. Delia pouted. "They make themselves poached egg on toast, stuff like that." "Oh, all right. 4 days," she finished in a burst, her pout going into overdrive. Jenny shuddered. Food was the great love of her life, and the thought of anyone going without a proper quantity of it for so long was horrendous. "I see. How many will I be cooking for?" Delia met the unwavering blue gaze and was the first to look away. The kitchen had somehow taken on an air of sudden animation, as if it were magically aware of the presence of a maestro. Delia herself was becoming aware of the force of the other woman's personality and felt an uprising of panic. "Well, there's my dad and Uncle Sid, Bert, my older brother, and his son Jeremy, and Bill. Bill's my other brother, and myself, of course, and Mrs. Jarvis. She's our daily. Part of her wages is a cooked meal. She's a widow. Her wages is a cooked meal. She's a widow, lives on her own. She's late in today, I dare say, with the snow and everything. Anyway, that's all. Bert's wife left him, and Bill isn't married. Nobody stays around here unless they have to." She finished her somewhat rumbling inventory with a bitter grimace. Jenny grunted and began a thorough check of the kitchen, noting utensils and supplies as she went. Delia watched her, clearly fascinated. The cook missed nothing. After 10 minutes, she'd assembled a pile of leeks and potatoes from the cold cellar and extracted some ham from the fridge. Herbs from the herb closet followed, and when, later, 2 men walked in, a blast of frigid air accompanying them, the room was filled with the smell of potato and leek soup and freshly baking bread. Bert and Bill Kelton both moved cautiously into the middle of the kitchen, staring first at the nearly 6-foot-tall figure of the unknown cook, then at their sister, then at each other. Jenny, noticing both their caution and lack of words, frowned over her saucepan. This would never do. She turned, looked them over, and nodded. "Gentlemen, I'm Jenny Starling. Your father hired me to cook for you over the Christmas season. There's ham, potato, and leek soup for lunch, with bread, fresh from the oven. Sit down and I'll lay the table." Bert, who was obviously the elder, slouched wordlessly at the table. He was, Jenny would learn later, 46 years old, and his thick brown hair had begun to turn grey. He watched the world through such sad brown eyes that he reminded Jenny of a bullock about to go to the slaughter. He seemed utterly defeated, but quite by what, she couldn't tell. Bill, younger by 10 years, still moved like a man in his prime. His hair was fair, like that of his sister, but his eyes were a soft grey blue. "Smelled good," he said, and gave Jenny a smile that would just have to do as her official welcome. She accepted both his compliment and greeting with a bow of her head, then looked up as one of the inner doors opened. The man who came through shuffled, as though raising his slipper-shod feet to take individual steps was beyond him. In fact, everything looked beyond him. He was tall, but stoop-shouldered. Consequently, the old grey cardigan that he wore hung almost to his knees. His hair was white and sparse, and on his skull, age spots showed like giant freckles. His chest looked caved in, and as he moved, he wheezed. His eyes, however, were the same grey blue as his younger nephew, and Jenny instantly knew that this could not be the Stan Kelton who had produced such contempt in the night of the road who'd given her the much-needed lift that morning. No, this could only be Uncle Sid. "Hello there, and who's this?" Sid Kelton asked amiably. "What's that delicious smell?" he added, his voice as paper-dry as a desert wind. His smile, though, was warm and sunny, and Jenny found herself rapidly moving forward and drawing a chair out for him to collapse into. "Good morning, Mr. Kelton. Your brother hired me to cook for the family." "Oh?" Sid Kelton looked troubled and glanced sympathetically at his niece. "Just for the Christmas season," Jenny added quickly, wanting to ease the old man's anxiety. She was rewarded by a look of relief and nodded to herself, returning to her stove to make sure her soup wasn't sticking to the bottom. It was a thick, nourishing soup, the way any good soup should be. As she stirred, she made a mental note. Whatever the reason behind Delia's rebellion, it was obvious that her uncle was on her side. And Jenny couldn't help but feel that any side Sid Kelton was on was the side she wanted to be on too. "You managed to clear off Spokeswain Bridge the NU2?" Sid was asking behind her, and both men were halfway through a humorous account of trying to find the river and the small bridge that crossed it in the blanket of snow, when the outer door was flung open and a blast of snow-washed air came in. Jenny turned, frowning fiercely, as yet another pair of dirty, snow-encrusted boots came into view. With a very audible tut of annoyance, she went straight to the cupboard where she'd noticed a mop and brought it out. She began to mop the floor with quick and efficient strokes, and only when she'd finished and put the mop away did she look up. She'd been aware of total silence throughout her endeavors. She'd also been aware of how the atmosphere of the room had compressed. It was as if all the previous warmth she had put into it, the stoking of the fire and the smells of good food, had somehow been brought to nothing. And when she looked up and met Stanley Kelton face to face, she understood why. Fierce brown eyes glinted from beneath bushy brows, but there was no touch of animal softness in these orbs. Stan Kelton was a bullish-looking man, from the width of his shoulders to the thickness of his waist. His large, beefy hands were chapped and reddened by the coldness outside, but he seemed oblivious to physical discomfort. His eyes ran over her, but there was no curiosity in them. "You're the cook, then," he said flatly, and it came as no surprise that his voice was loud and dominating. Jenny felt her backbone stiffen. "I am," she said, in a decibel above that she'd normally use. "And I'd appreciate it if you men would remove your boots before coming in here. The floor is a disgrace." Behind her, somebody gasped. Or rather, several people gasped. Jenny had the feeling that nobody, spoke to the old man like that. But Stan Kelton did not, as she had half expected, explode into a show of temper. For a long moment, he simply considered her in silence. Then he walked over to the stove, lifted the lid off the saucepan, reached for a spoon, and took a taste. Now everyone seemed to hold their breath except for Jenny. Jenny Starling already knew that the soup was excellent. Stan Kelton turned back to her. "Good soup," he said, "but nobody takes their boots off before coming in here, especially not in weather like this. There's no porch out there, and I ain't gonna stand around in the cold trying to prise my wellies off just to suit you. Get used to the mop." And with that, he walked to the table, took the chair that was positioned at the top, and sat down. Head of the table, head of the house. His power was so obvious it was almost farcical. "Is that bread ready yet?" he asked. Jenny regarded him steadily. Quickly, she measured the trouble of an argument against any possible gains, and shrugged philosophically. "In a few minutes. Then it must cool. Eating hot bread is bad for the digestion." She waited, as if expecting him to comment. Her gaze never wavered. "Aye," he finally said, and leaned back, stretching his cramped muscles. "I expect you're right. You seem to know what you're about right enough. I don't have to tell you what I expect food-wise, do I?" "No," Jenny said coolly. "You don't? I'll make the mince pies tomorrow. Will it be turkey or goose Christmas Day?" "Goose, woman," Stan Kelton said firmly. Jenny nodded. "Goose it is. Christmas pudding then to follow?" She didn't wait for his assent. They already understood one another perfectly. Wordlessly, she turned back to the stove. Sid Kelton looked at his brother thoughtfully, then glanced across at the two boys. He frowned. Delia watched the cook, playing nervously with the buttons on her red dress. Jenny stirred her soup and sighed. Well, this was a cheerful place and no mistake. As she took the bread out of the oven and laid it on a tray to cool, she began to wish that she were back at her bedsit in Oxford, one small gas ring or not. "Merry Christmas, Jenny," she told herself wryly. Chapter 2. The last drop of soup had gone, and she'd made 6 pints, and the last crumb of bread had been devoured. Hard luck on any birds hanging around in the courtyard hoping for some crumbs. And the kitchen floor was once again muddy, where the men had left the table and trumped back out again. Jenny surveyed the sink full of washing up, and the dirty floor and sighed heavily. At the table, only Delia remained. She stayed stubbornly seated, arms folded firmly across her chest, her expression mutinous. Not that Jenny had expected any help from that quarter. "Has your uncle gone for a nap?" she asked instead, returning to the mop, which was already beginning to feel as familiar as a lifelong friend, and setting to on the floor. Although it wasn't technically part of her duties to be a cleaner, she simply couldn't abide a kitchen that wasn't clean. No doubt her celebrity chef father would have minions to see to his every whim, but his traveling cook daughter had to make shift for herself. When the younger girl didn't answer, Jenny smiled. "After a meal it does a man good to sleep for a while," she offered pleasantly, which would be her one and only attempt at friendship. Should it be rebuffed, she could quite happily leave the petulant little madam to her own sulky devices. She was here to cook, not to be popular. Delia eventually shrugged. "For an invalid, take a nap, you mean?" She corrected her, but there was no malice in her voice, and she half turned to look affectionately at the door to the hall, where Sid, no doubt, probably was already dozing by the fire. "It was a wicked bite of pneumonia, and an asthma attack that did it, you know," she said sadly. Jenny, with the floor once more looking respectable, stopped mopping and looked up. "Ah," she said softly, in immediate and sympathetic understanding. "His chest is weak." "Yes," Delia confirmed. "He was in hospital for nearly 6 months, back in the 70s. When he came back to the farm, he just couldn't pick up where he left off. Didn't have the physical stamina anymore, you know. And he was still youngish then, I suppose," she mused doubtfully. "Lucky for him, Dad was here," she added, her voice so suddenly loaded with vitriol that Jenny, caught in the act of adding washing up liquid to the dishes, quickly turned her head. "What you mean?" she asked sharply, not sure why her own curiosity was so firmly aroused. She didn't really want to learn any more about the intricacies of the Kelton family, after all. She just wanted to keep her head down, work out the 2 weeks, and hot-foot it back to Oxford before any funny business, or downright unfunny business, took place. Yet there was something so incredibly desperate in the girl's voice that before she could stop herself, she'd already asked the question. "Uncle Sid's the oldest, you see," Delia said. "It wasn't just his illness that made him look years older than Dad." "I don't follow," Jenny said, giving up the fight and turning from the sink. She took the chair opposite the girl and looked at her frankly. Delia didn't seem to mind. In fact, she looked only too happy to dish the family dirt. When the farm was first built, about 300 years ago, the original owner was, well, a bit of a rogue, as Mrs. Jarvis would say. He was rich. He didn't have a title, but he was wild and crafty, and used to getting his own way, Delia began. Although quite why she chose to start her story so far back in history, Jenny, for the moment, had no idea. His name was Greenslade, a gambler and womanizer. He lived a right old life of Riley, Delia continued, her brown eyes coming alive. "I dare say he saw a bit of the world," she added so wistfully that the cook almost winced. The girl's desire to do the same was so palpable, it almost throbbed in the air between them. "Anyway," Delia shrugged off her daydreams and got back to the story. "He married some local woman who was rich and all that, but apparently they didn't get on so well. She didn't like his womanizing, I expect," Delia opined, with a shrug of her shoulders, as if to say that all men were the same, and what else could she have expected? "He certainly had a few children on the wrong side of the blanket anyway," she continued. "Eventually things got so bad between them that the wife moved out of their newly built farm and went back home to her mother. Greenslade was livid, apparently, since she took the children, their children that is, with him. So he hunted around for all his other offspring, the illegitimate ones I mean, and had them come to live with him." Delia grinned widely. Imagine the scandal that caused. But not content with that, he had his lawyers draw up an entailment for the farm in perpetuity, stating that the oldest son, no matter whether he was legitimate or not, had to inherit the farm. That really was one in the eye for his wife. Delia laughed, obviously applauding Greenslade's revenge. Jenny pursed her lips. It was, she had to admit, very racy stuff. "I expect that curbed a lot of your ancestors' more, rampant behavior," she mused, a twinkle in her eye. "Knowing that your peccadillos with the milkmaid might turn out to be sons that will inherit the family manor, I mean." Delia giggled. "I'll bet it did. Perhaps that's why Dad's such a hypocrite. He can't stand going to church, but his father attended regularly and made him go, so now we all have to toe the line as well. I dare say the Kelton men had it hammered into them right from the start to stay on the straight and narrow or else." Jenny nodded, but her eyes were thoughtful. "You really don't like your father very much, do you?" she asked quietly. "And I don't mean you just don't get on. Lots of daughters and fathers I expect don't get on. But you seem to actively dislike him." There was no judgment in her voice, no spurious nosiness. But even so, Delia's pretty face filled with color. "I hate him," she confirmed vehemently, and raised a shaking hand to brush a lock of fair hair from her forehead. "But then, so do Bill and Bert, so does Mrs. Jarvis if it comes to that, as does everyone who even remotely knows him, in fact," she finished, with a forced and unconvincing laugh. She met the cook's eyes defiantly and tossed her head, her young voice rang with passionate conviction. "I dare say even Uncle Sid hates him deep down. He's every right to, when all's said and done. Dad even got his way with him." Jenny gave herself a mental shake. It had given her quite a turn, finding out the real depths of Delia's feelings. Even though she herself had already felt a fair bit of antipathy towards Stanley Kelton, and considered him a sorry excuse for a human being, she couldn't help but feel that it seemed somehow unnatural for a daughter to feel the same way. Even so, she believed instinctively that the reason and the fault lay firmly at Stan Kelton's own doorstep. So perhaps it was not so unnatural after all. Love had to be earned, in Jenny's experience, every bit as much as respect. Now, with Delia's last observation, she turned her thoughts back to more practical matters. "What do you mean by that? Your Uncle Sid doesn't seem the sort of man to hate anyone," she chided, but only gently. The girl was obviously very highly strung, and it probably wouldn't do to get her too heated. Delia hung her head and sighed. "No, you're probably right. Sid's a dear old thing. But don't you see, it's doubly important for the Keltons that the oldest son should inherit, and by rights that should have been Sid, and any son that Sid might have had. But Dad got his own way yet again. It must have really enraged him, being born the second son. But he never let that stop him. He's always wanted the farm for his own." "But it does belong to Sid, doesn't it?" Jenny asked, puzzled. "I mean, even if your father does most of the physical labor that your uncle can't, surely the farm still belongs to Sid. Labor that your uncle can't, surely the farm still belongs to Sid. Legally and all." "Oh, technically I suppose it does," Delia said, and then stood up angrily. "Who was the one who married and had the next son to inherit the precious farm? Who sits at the head of the table? She tossed her head, her color high once more. "No, Uncle Sid, is it?" she hissed. "It's him. He always gets what he wants. He's like a big fat leech, beating off everyone else." On a sob, Delia turned and fled the room, and a moment later, Jenny could hear footsteps pounding up some stairs. She sighed and glanced at her own hold-all. She hadn't even been shown to her room yet, but she was in no hurry. It would probably be freezing cold up there, and she was quite content to stay in the warmth of her kitchen. She attacked the dishes, musing as she did so on the old family history. At some point, the farm must have changed hands through some reckless action of an inheriting son. Unless, of course, the original Greenslade's bastard son had been a Kelton. Still, it did seem a pity that Sid had not married and produced a son. It would probably have done Stanley Kelton a world of good to not get his own way for once. She wondered if his ill health was the only reason for Sid not marrying, or if there were yet more family skeletons waiting to be discovered in the Kelton farm cupboards. She was just finishing the dishes when the door opened on a blast of cold air. The woman who came in paused by the fireplace to remove her sodden boots, at least sparing most of the kitchen floor, and it was this simple act that identified her. Mrs. Jarvis, the Daily, had to be. Only a daily would think about sparing herself the work of clearing up after her own muddy footprints. As she turned and caught sight of the cook, she froze comically, her mouth falling open in stunned surprise. She glanced around quickly, almost as if to check she had come to the right house. "Hello, I'm Jenny Starling. Mr. Kelton hired me to cook over the festive season. You must be Mrs. Jarvis." She beamed at her, amiably. Mrs. Jarvis slowly removed her headscarf, revealing tired gray curls in need of a new perm. Her face was heavily lined, her eyes sunken in her head. Jenny wondered, with a concerned pang, what had made the woman look so ill and defeated. "Is young Delia around?" the daily asked, her voice sounding as tired as the rest of her looked, and making no attempt to even acknowledge the introduction. "Upstairs, I think," Jenny said, and watched as the older woman walked through into the hall. There she heard her shouting up that the footpath to the dell was now open again. When she came back, she took in the newly mopped floor and sniffed the air, still redolent of soup. She looked like a wary old cat that had come home to find a new kitten installed. "My cottage and Cordelia Bray's place lie just over the hill," she said, by way of explanation for her shouting up to Delia. "Delia's great pals with Sissy Bray, Cordelia's girl. Bill and Bert have just now managed to clear a path through, otherwise I'd have been in just as early as always," she continued defensively. "But you have to cross the bridge over the river, and in this snow, I didn't dare try and find it until—" Jenny, suddenly understanding the reason for this wave of nervous chatter, waved her hand airily. "Oh, that's all right. No need to explain to me. I'm just here for a couple of weeks to cook, that's all. Then I'll be on my way again." Mrs. Jarvis looked infinitely relieved, and most oddly at the same time, she also looked fiercely resentful. "Oh, I thought the devil was up to one of his tricks again." Jenny blinked and wondered once again what had turned Mrs. Jarvis's world on its head, and whether or not it might have affected her mental processes. Having to work with a mad housemaid on top of everything else would really put the cherry on top of the Christmas cake. Unless, of course, she was one of these profoundly religious people. Catching the look on her face, Mrs. Jarvis managed a smile. It looked pitiful, but it was definitely a smile. "Don't worry, I'm not mad. I was talking about Stan Kelton. I call him the devil because that's what he is." Jenny couldn't help frowning. As Delia had foretold, it was yet somebody else who hated Stan Kelton. But to call him the devil was surely a bit over the top, wasn't it? "I've only just met Mr. Kelton," she said cautiously, and turned back to the stove, where she had lamb chops ready for dinner. Some dried rosemary mixed with flour and lots of breadcrumbs and salt would make a nice crust for the tender meat. Mashed potatoes, mashed with real butter and the cream from the top of the milk, would do just nicely. And there was diced carrot and swede for vegetables. She nodded. Good, filling, tasty food. That was what concerned her. She doubted that farm workers would be impressed by cordon bleu proportions and experimental cuisine. Hot and filling. That's what was obviously required around here. She definitely did not want to know why Stan Kelton was the devil, or what tricks he might have played on poor Mrs. Jarvis. It was none of her business. But even as she told herself this, Jenny Starling was painfully aware that it might well turn out to be her business after all. Things had a way of happening around her. Her father, a chef over in France, had recently begun mentioning in his letters a medium known for relieving people who were jinxed. Jenny had very politely told her beloved daddy what to do with his medium. Still, she was bound to admit that things did have a nasty habit of happening around her. But she preferred to think of it as fate, as if some obscure destiny had allotted to her the role of nemesis, and was determined to wait for her to be in just the right place, at just the wrong time, in order to bring about the tragedies it had in store. "And you're getting way too fanciful," "Jenny, old girl," she told herself stoutly. It was Christmas Eve tomorrow, and what could possibly go wrong on Christmas Eve? Delia came down, muffled from head to toe in a long coat, scarf, and gloves, and rushed out the door without a word. Mrs. Jarvis watched her and shook her head. Poor girl. She's so desperate to get away from here, it fair breaks the heart to watch her. And Sissy is just as desperate to get away from her poor mum. Cordelia's a self-made invalid, you know, she said chattily to Jenny, but without any obvious rancor. You know the type. Her husband was killed in a car crash last year, and she took to her bed and never left. She could leave it, if she wanted to, of course, at any time, but why bother? Her Sissy's about the same age as Delia, and they spend all that time together, plotting their escape to London. I know, I've heard 'em, chattering like two excited magpies. Mrs. Jarvis paused, but only for breath. Of course, they'll never get away. Cordelia could make a stone feel guilty, and she'll never let her Sissy escape. She'd have to face up to life if that happened, wouldn't she? And that devil will never let Delia go either. He keeps her penniless, you know. No wonder she finally snapped and said she wasn't going to cook a thing this Christmas. He never even pays her a pittance of a wage for all the work she does around here. Too scared she'd hoard it and be off, I expect. Slave labor is what the devil demands from all the family. And all she'd need is the price of a train ticket and she could be gone. Poor kid doesn't even get new clothes, not unless the devil buys them for her. Jenny, who'd been busy making the crust for the meat, finally gave a great sigh and swilled her hands under the sink. So that was why Delia had been wearing a dress that was far too small for her, and Mrs. Jarvis was determined to make sure that everyone knew it too. But what was she supposed to do about it? Delia could find herself a job in Oxford or Cheltenham if she really wanted to, but breaking free took courage, and courage was something nobody else could give you. "Dare say you want to get on," Jenny said firmly. "I don't know if you used to help out in the kitchen, but I think I can manage it all on my own. That'll take some of the load off, I expect," she added pointedly. Mrs. Jarvis met the younger woman's level stare and sighed. She was obviously not going to be drawn, and that was all there was to it. "Fine. I'll start in the parlor," she said flatly. "The fire there always needs raking out. But—" she half turned and gave the cook a toe-curling look of contempt. "You can thank your lucky stars, young missy, that you're only going to be around here for a few weeks. Stay any longer, and you'll become just like the rest of us, no matter how much you think you wouldn't. That Kelton devil can destroy the spirit of anyone he wants, you included." She dabbed a finger in the air. Jenny almost expected her to spit as well. But with that rather bone-chilling prophecy, she swung around and shuffled out of the room. Despite herself, Jenny shivered. "Well, honestly, it's like living in an episode of a soap," she muttered, more for the comfort of hearing her own voice than anything else. "Or like something out of one of those Gothic novels," she carried on crossly. "An old farmhouse cut off by snow, a dour old servant going around prophesying doom and despair." "And stop talking to yourself," she admonished herself briskly, suddenly realizing what she was doing. From behind her came a dry chuckle. "Good idea. Folks around here might get the wrong idea, finding their cook muttering to herself over the custard. The thought of a loopy cook tends to make most folk nervous." Sid Kelton slowly made his way to the table, his twinkling eyes and wide smile belying his words. Jenny found herself chuckling. This would never do. She stopped at once and reached for the kettle. "A cup of tea, I think," she said firmly, and Sid, about to sink into a chair, looked up, ears cocked at the sound of scratching at the door. "A pooch," he said anxiously. He looked at the distance to the door, then down at the comfortable chair, so close, and sighed. But by the time he'd looked back up, Jenny was already on her way to the door. She opened it. A blast of icy air hit her, and a black and white streak shot past her and vanished. Jenny closed the door, blinked, and looked around the kitchen. No sign of it. She moved to the sink, put the kettle on, and gave a quick check under the table. No pooch. She walked over to the cupboard to extract the sugar and glanced behind the dresser. A narrow space, but no pooch. She moved to the fridge, got out the milk, and checked under the claw-footed Welsh dresser. No pooch. From the table, Sid watched her surreptitious search, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears of mirth. Don't tell me, Jenny thought grimly. We're back to the Gothic novel again, and the pooch is going to turn out to be a ghost dog. Saved his master from drowning 50 years ago, but died valiantly himself in the village duck pond. Now he haunts the farm, fooling visitors into thinking he's a real, live, flesh-and-blood mutt. She glanced at the shut door that led out to the hall. No doubt the dour Mrs. Jarvis had chased poor Sid from his place by the fire, but he'd shut the door behind him when he'd first come in. So where in the world had the mutt disappeared to? She'd never seen an animal move so fast. She made the tea, returned to the table, handed Sid his mug, and sat down. She took a sip. Sid watched her thinking about it, sipped his own brew, and wondered what she'd do next. Jenny, after having thought it through, lifted the tablecloth, ducked down and checked the chairs, and there, sat next to Sid, and curled up tightly on the chair so that his tail didn't droop and give away his position, was the dog. One of Sid's hands rested on his head and fondled one floppy ear. The mutt, alerted to movement, turned doleful eyes in her direction. His expression was perfectly pathetic. It was clear that he expected to be evicted once more into the snow, and was doing that heart-melting, don't hurt me, big brown-eyed thing that a variety of animals did so well. Jenny straightened up, glanced at Sid and sighed. I suppose I shall have to get used to keeping on lookout for dog hairs, she said mildly. Sid smiled. We knew we could trust you the moment we set eyes on you, didn't we, Pooch? From beneath the table came a whine. It didn't sound so sure. The thing is, Sid said, his dry, labored breathing breaking into a choking laugh. Pooch doesn't like sheep. He'll do anything to avoid going out with the boys. Stan won't have the dog indoors. Says it ruins a good sheepdog. Jenny met Sid's eyes and began to chuckle again. A sheepdog that didn't like sheep. Now she'd heard it all. She shut off the laughter abruptly in mid-gurgle as the door opened and Mrs. Jarvis came in, took one hurt look at the teapot, and went out again. Jenny sighed. I suppose I should have called to her that we were having tea, she said, feeling instantly guilty. I was going to have to make her one as soon as she came in. She looked frozen, but... She trailed off quickly. But I bet she never gave you the chance, Sid said, his smile going, the twinkle in his eyes fading, leaving them looking dull and cloudy. Jenny felt her own good mood vaporize. She looks ill, she said, by way of explanation as well as excuse. Not for anything would she tell Sid about Mrs. Jarvis's tirade against his brother. For one thing, she'd never betray another woman like that. Besides, it would hardly be diplomatic. But Sid didn't need telling. Instead, he reached for his spoon and began unnecessarily to stir his tea. For a long moment, the only sound was that of his labored breathing. Once more, Jenny felt herself being drawn into the drama of the Kelton family saga, and opened her mouth to tell Sid that she really didn't want to know. But she'd left it too late. Mrs. Jarvis was widowed recently. A few months back, in fact. Her husband, Tom, had a small holding just over in the dell. A fair few acres, some sheep, goats, free-range chickens and eggs, that sort of thing. Oh, I see, Jenny said sadly. It was not illness as such that had drawn the lines of defeat on Mrs. Jarvis's face. or scored the wounds deep in her soul. Thing is, Sid continued diffidently, she blames Stan. He sighed heavily and shrugged his painfully thin shoulders. So does everyone else for that matter, he added, with determined truthfulness. Jenny felt a cold hand snake up her back. Oh? She asked warily. Why's that? Sid looked up and met her eyes. He looked pretty defeated himself. Because he was to blame, I expect, he admitted quietly. The dell adjoins Kelton land. It's good grazing, and the big barn Tom Jarvis had built near the spinney was ideal for an overwinter feeding place and shelter for our own flocks. But Tom Jarvis didn't want to sell. And, Sid sighed, forcing himself to face up to facts. I dare say Stan wouldn't really have offered him a fair price. Sedelia was right, Jenny thought glumly. Stan Kelton did own the farm in Albert name. He did the buying, the selling, and no doubt everything else as well. Sid stopped stirring his tea and looked up. Things began to happen after that. His voice was flat and curiously lifeless. The river got mysteriously dammed and flooded the lower pasture of the dell. Tom lost his whole flock of sheep. Then at market, Stan began to undercut him, selling at a loss to himself just to ensure Jarvis, too, lost money. He was forced to take out a bank loan, and they foreclosed on him. Sid continued grimly. He felt guilt and remorse over what had happened to his neighbor was obvious, even though it was none of his own doing. That his brother Stan felt neither was a foregone conclusion, lying heavily between them. There was a rumor that Stan was threatening to take Tom to court over every little thing, knowing that Tom wasn't much for forms and letters and such and couldn't afford a solicitor anyhow. He shook his head sadly. It was probably true, he acknowledged, his papery voice little more than a whisper now. It's just the sort of thing he'd do. But whatever was said, or not said, the result was that Tom Jarvis died of a heart attack brought on by all the stress, and Stan got the land cheap from the bank, just like he wanted. Delia's impassioned speech of less than an hour ago suddenly flooded back into Jenny's mind. Stan Kelton always got what he wanted. A leech, living off the blood of others. But why on earth is Mrs. Jarvis working here? She asked, instead of asking why Sid Kelton let his younger brother get away with such things. For she already knew the answer, as must everyone else. Sid was simply no match for Stan. He probably never had been. And yet, she couldn't find it in her heart to think less of Sid. Instead, she found herself despising Stanley Kelton all the more. Sid shook his head, his skin stretched tight across his face, his eyes seeming to sink ever deeper into his head. Their cottage went with the land, he explained. Or Gladys was facing eviction, but my brother didn't really need the cottage. Our shepherds and farmhands all live in estate cottages already. Plus, we own a fair few properties in the village itself. I dare say not even Stan had the nerve to throw a widow out onto the streets. He may not care what people think of him, but even Stan knows he has to live in these parts. And there are some limits, even for him. He sighed and drained his mug of tea. He didn't look any the better for it. Besides, he continued, Stan has an eye for a bargain. He let Gladys stay on at the house, provided she came and worked here. Delia never was much of a housekeeper, and of course he doesn't have to pay Gladys anything like a decent wage. He takes half her pay before she even gets it as rent for the cottage. Yep. Always had an eye for a bargain as Stan. When he finished, he looked and sounded exhausted. In silence, Jenny collected their mugs and took them to the sink. What could she say? What could she possibly say? The devil. Poor Gladys Jarvis had called him. Playing evil tricks. How right she was, it seemed. Chapter 3. The dog had stayed on in the kitchen when Sid returned to his place by the fire in the living room. Obviously the mutt knew better than to enter the inner sanctum of the house, even with Sid for protection. Now he lifted his head and shot to his feet. His ears, which had been flopped lazily over his nose, sprang to quivering attention. In a flash, he shot like a black and white streak of lightning to the big Welsh-style dresser, which stood about 4 inches off the floor, on sturdy square legs. There, before her astonished eyes, the dog did a trick worthy of any stage magician or octopus, and flattened his flanks and rear end enough to sidle into the tiny space. Even so, his spine scraped along the top of the wood, making her wince in empathy. His shining eyes disappeared into the gloom, and the last bit of all to disappear was his plumy tail, withdrawn into the cavity, like a mouse going down a hole. Jenny fought the sudden urge to applaud, and quickly turned away from the dresser. After a performance like that, she was not about to give the animal's position away. She'd just picked up a spoon with which to stir the gravy, when the door opened on the now familiar blast of snow-chilled wind. She was already reaching resignedly for the mop by the time the last of them had straggled in. Bill, the younger of the sons, gave her a guilty look as she quickly eradicated his soggy and muddy footprints from the floor, along with all the rest. Bert, she noticed, headed straight for the table, and sat with the quick, ungrateful slump of a truly exhausted man. Yet he looked fit enough. It was not the actual work, she thought wisely, that was sapping his energy. Like a king ascending his rightful throne, Stan Kelton sat in the head chair and unbuttoned his coat. His hands were huge and dirty, and Jenny wondered how many sheep he had dug out of the snowdrifts that day. She came and stood by the table. "Are you going to wash your hands?" she asked him bluntly, and what little desultory conversation there had been, mostly Delia asking Bill if the road to the village was cleared yet, stopped abruptly. Stan Kelton met her eyes, then glanced down at his hands. "Later, perhaps," he growled, bristling at her challenge. "Why?" He thrust his whiskered chin forward, brows beetling in anticipation of her defiance. Jenny pursed her lips. "You can eat straight after you've been rolling about in manure and clearing out the chicken pens for all I care," she conceded loftily. Her voice was now as cold as the snow outside. "So long as neither I nor my food are blamed for it if you come down later with a galloping gut rot." She straightened her back and met his eye, which was not easy, since she stood at 6 feet 1 inch tall. She didn't even so much as blink. One way or another, she'd had a lot of practice at this sort of thing. She'd once had a lot of trouble over just this issue, concerning a canal engineer she'd once cooked for, and his very inquisitive pet rat. That unfortunate alliance had resulted in a truly lamentable incident that had left a rather queasy feeling in her stomach for quite a few weeks afterwards. She had learned from that very hard lesson to get things straight about matters of hygiene right from the start. Stan held her gaze for a moment, then grunted. She took that to mean an acknowledgement, nodded once, and returned to the oven. Once there, she dished up the meal in silence, served it, and in silence it was eaten. After a few tentative bites, Bill, Delia, and young Jeremy, Bert's son, dug in heartily, the young nearly always being the most ravenous. It did her heart good to see such sturdy appetites. Bert ate with a stolid resignation that was painful on the eye. Jenny hated to see anybody eat and not thoroughly enjoy the experience. Indeed, it was so totally unnatural it gave her goosebumps. She eyed him soulfully over the mashed potatoes. Stan Kelton himself ate everything with gusto. in painful contrast his older brother, who could only manage a small portion of his food. This, Jenny also found distressing, but forgivable, since poor Sid looked physically incapable of eating a hearty meal. She found the silence oppressive, but knew better than to break it. Only after the last plate had been pushed away did someone speak, and then, predictably, it was the tyrant himself. "Well, that was all right, Miss... Starling. Right? Starling. But a bit plain. I expected something fancier from a professional cook." Sid coughed. "I thought it was delicious, dear. I only wish I could have eaten more. Do you like my potatoes like that? Parsley and herbs sprinkled on them before they go into the pan, yes?" "Yeah. Nice grub," Bill suddenly said, his shoulders hunching, as if expecting a blow. His eyes, however, blazed defiant, and when they met the gaze of his father, they refused to drop. "And what would you know?" Stan sneered at him, his large body stiffening at this unexpected show of rebellion. "You're as green as a cabbage, boy, and about as useless." Jenny stared at him in astonishment. For a start, she couldn't believe that Stan Kelton felt the need to even reply. It was such a small thing to get riled about. Surely the man wasn't such a megalomaniac that a mere comment about food would need to be trampled on so thoroughly. No. She was sure that wasn't the issue. As Bill glowered and turned red, she suddenly understood that this argument had nothing to do with her food, which was a relief, to be sure. No. This had been brewing for some time by the looks of it. It had only needed Bill to work up the nerve to go against his father, even in so small a way, for the floodgates to open. As Sid reached out and laid a warning hand on Bill's arm, Stan Kelton got to his feet. His fists, Jenny noticed, were clenched at his sides. He looked ready to explode. "I've made an apple and cinnamon tart for pudding, with custard, of course. Who wants some?" she asked quickly. She hated scenes. People, she thought grimly, really should have more sense than to go out of their way to create them, especially at mealtimes. "I do," Bill said quickly, his ruddy, handsome face darkening still more as he continued the pointless defiance. "I can't think of anything else I want more," he added, just in case he hadn't made it plain enough. Stan Kelton laughed. It was as dismissive and derisive a laugh as the cook had ever heard. It made even her teeth clench together, as if someone had just scraped a long hard nail against a blackboard, and she wasn't even the recipient of it. "Have your apple pie, lad," Stan sneered, relegating Bill from 36 to 16 with contemptuous ease. "It might put some lead in your pencil, though I doubt it." Bill at once reared to his feet like an angry lion. "And what's that supposed to mean?" he challenged, blue eyes blazing. His father's implacable brown eyes stared back at him. "I mean, boy, that it's Bert who's apt to be careful, and he was, more praise to him. He had young Jeremy there in proper wedlock." Jeremy, a young lad who seemed to have the ability to disappear into the wallpaper, since Jenny had hardly noticed him at all, blushed like a beetroot and ducked his head. He was a handsome boy, with rich brown hair and the dark, gentle eyes of a deer. His natural shyness would have made an easy cannon fodder for his grandfather, Jenny guessed with real pity. But fortunately for him, it was his Uncle Bill who was standing against the firing squad wall at this particular moment in time. "You were always free to go about and sow your wild oats where you liked," Stan continued, his sneering voice grating on everyone's nerves. "And under the dresser, even the mutt shivered. I don't see much evidence of oats around here. What's the matter, lad? Not capable?" "Enough of that." The voice was weak, for it came from Sid, but the tone was surprisingly forceful. It stopped both Stan and Bill in surprised mid-threat. "I Enough, Stan said quickly. Before, you've been listening wonderfully. Now take a brief musical break to recharge, breathe, and simply enjoy the moment. We're grateful to have you here. Bill, who was staring at his uncle in astonishment, could respond. Let's sit down and all have some of this here tart. It's what I've paid hard-earned cash for anyways. Jenny turned her oven, lips pursed. Paid for indeed. Anyone would think he'd forked out a fortune instead of just the going wage. She had a good mind to get him mince tomorrow, and as greasy as she could make it. But pride forbade it. She wouldn't serve greasy mince to the sheepdog, let alone a human being, even if said Homo sapiens was named Stan Kelton. She took the huge jug of creamy and steaming custard, flavored with rum, to the table, and cut the large tart into generous portions. Delia, she noticed, had the grace to blush as she met the cook's eyes, but, like her brother, she too seemed hell-bent on rebellion. And Jenny still couldn't see Stanley getting any cooked meals from his daughter when her own 2 weeks here were up. Now wasn't that a shame? You better come with me and pick out the goose, Bert said to her an hour or so later. The kitchen was cleared of both debris and inhabitants, and his unexpected presence just behind her left shoulder made her jump in surprise. Sorry, he mumbled, taking a shuffling step back. Close up, he looked even more tired than before. His skin was striving to match his graying hair. Goose, she echoed blankly, then nodded. Oh, goose. I didn't see any as I came in this morning. They're probably still in the barn. Delia's supposed to let them out first thing, but I dare say she forgot. He walked towards the door, pausing by the dresser as he did so. Come on. Out of it. No movement. Pooch, he growled, his no-nonsense tone causing one white paw to emerge, followed by a black nose. Like a snake, the dog wriggled out into the open and gave Bert his most impressively pathetic look. Come on out, Bert said, but managed a bare tilt of his lips. I've never seen a dog get into such a small space before, Jenny said, unaccountably moved by the man's smile. She wondered how long it had been since he'd smiled last. You'd be surprised, Bert said, glancing down at the droop-eared, droop-tailed dog. He hates sheep, you see. That's his problem. He'll do anything to get out of coming into the fields with us. Never known a sheepdog like him. Oh, he can do the job, but you can almost hear him muttering and complaining about it under his breath as he rounds them up. And he hates sleeping in the barn at night. I've had to search the house many a night to find his hiding place. If Dad catches him in the house even once... He let the sentence trail off, but frowned down at the dog. The mutt wagged a hopeful tail. Stupid hound, Bert muttered, but absently stroked the dog's silky head before turning back to look at the cook. I should get your coat if I were you, he advised her. It's perishing out there. More snow to come, I reckon, he added. And as he looked at her, his eyes seemed to focus on her properly for the first time, and he was not the first man to realize that the Amazonian cook was surprisingly attractive. Jenny agreed with his assessment of the weather a few moments later, as she stepped out into the dark courtyard and shuddered in the cold. The dog slouched by Bert's side as they headed across the yard, their boots crunching deep in the snow. The light from the kitchen window giving the night a lovely orange glow. Running alongside one wall of the house was the ramshackle corridor that led to the stables. It was probably bitterly cold in there as well, but at least it gave anybody going from the house into the stable block shelter from the elements. As soon as Bert pushed open the door to the barn, something flew out of the darkness from within. Something white, spectral, and honking. The dog gave a yelp of alarm and shot off into the gloomy interior, haunches a bare few inches off the ground, tongue lolling from his mouth in silent terror, the honking spectre fast on his heels. By her side, Bert gave a low chuckle. That gander hates Pooch with a vengeance. Mind you, that gander hates everybody. The geese are further on in. He turned and lit a small old-fashioned paraffin lump that had been hanging on the door jamb. Just point out the bird you want, and I'll see to it for you. Jenny wondered if the Keltons were so hard up that they couldn't afford to have electric light laid on in the outbuildings, then decided that it was far more likely that Stan Kelton was so mean that he didn't see why he should bother when 60-year-old lamp still worked, and worker safety or risk of a fire be damned. Jenny sighed and followed Bert inside. From somewhere came an outraged, terrified yelp that indicated the gander had scored a direct peck on Pooch's posterior. Off to her left, the mutt quickly scrambled up a wide wooden ladder that led to the loft above, and for a moment, a thwarted gander paced at the bottom, honking angrily. No doubt he did so every night, frustrated by his inability to climb. Bert, or whoever was in charge of the geese, must keep their wings clipped, thus preventing flight. How annoying it must be for him, Jenny thought sympathetically, and turned to peruse the geese, her experienced eye picking out a young, tender-breasted bird. She pointed it out, and Bert nodded. She turned away as he caught and casually dispatched the bird with a single humane twist to the neck with his big, strong hands. City slickers would have fainted on the spot. It made even Jenny feel slightly sick. Finally sensing another alien presence in his barn, the gander left the cowardly mutt to his hayloft and came hissing out of the night, wings stretched out to an impressive length either side of him. Jenny turned and watched his approach, not in the least put out. As the gander gained the last 5 yards, she moved rapidly to one side and put her hands on her hips. The surprised gander slid past her, skidded to a halt, and turned around, neck extended, beady eye trained on her shin. Before it could give even one honk, she said quietly, "I'm here to pick out the Christmas goose." She leaned down, looked the bird in his gimlet eye, and said even more quietly, "But I could always make it a Christmas gander." The bird blinked. He took a step back, then another, then blinked again. Jenny nodded. She'd always had a way with animals. It was Bert who showed her to her room that night, apologizing as he did so for nobody thinking to see to her comfort earlier. "Think nothing of it," Jenny said airily, following his solid frame up the stairs. Her room, as she'd expected, was as cold as sorbet, but spacious enough, with plenty of blankets on a fair-sized bed. Bert rubbed his hands and blew on them, for perhaps the first time playing the part of host, and running headfirst into the fact that Kelton Farm was not the most hospitable of places. "There should be a fire lit in here," he muttered, and stared at the empty grate as if he'd never seen it before. He never even seemed to question the fact that there should have been central heating installed years ago. "I'm surprised Uncle Sid didn't light one. He's usually the thoughtful one around here," he added with a twist of his lips. After Janice left, he begun, then abruptly cut off the sentence, as if expecting a reprimand. Janice was probably his absentee wife, Jenny guessed, and no doubt mention of her around here was strictly taboo. Stan Kelton would have made sure of that. He wouldn't have taken kindly to one of his minions escaping from under his very nose. Of that, Jenny was convinced. So when the new cook made no comment, but merely looked at him curiously, Bert sighed and shook his head. "My wife," he said, unnecessarily. "She walked out on us. But if she'd still been here, you would have had a fire in your room." He said nothing more, but turned and left, just a little grayer, just a little more tired than before. Yet those few simple words of his said more about Janice and Bert's feelings towards Janice than anything else could have done. She wondered sadly how Jeremy had felt about his mother's leaving and why the boy hadn't gone with her. He looked to be about 18 now. How long had Janice been gone exactly? Not long, she would have thought, not with Bert still pining so strongly for her. She did not ask herself why Janice had left. That was obvious, and could be summed up in 2 words. Stan Kelton. She awoke around 6. It was still dark outside and snowing lightly. She rose and dressed in a hurry, the cold nipping at her skin like tiny pincers, and she had a lot of skin on her large frame to be nipped. In the kitchen, she quickly got the fire going, and the stove lit, with the plentiful supply of logs kept by the grate. Without a thought, she went to the door, unlocked it, and opened it. The dog shot in and vanished. He, no doubt, had a secret gander-free exit from the top of the hayloft. Besides, any dog would rather jump for his life than risk the pecking beak of the white wonder. Jenny made herself a cup of tea and decided on porridge, just because she was sure Stan Kelton was a bacon and eggs kind of man. It was still practically dark when Mrs. Jarvis arrived, the chip on her shoulder accompanied by a mass of snowflakes. Without a word, Jenny made the woman a cup of tea and rose to see the porridge. The men would be down soon, she was sure, and anxious to make the most of the meagre winter light. "I see you've got the goose then," Mrs. Jarvis said, nodding to the bird that was hung up just inside the open larder door. "Bert reminded me last night," Jenny agreed, and hefted a milk churn from the cold cellar. "Ah, Bert's a good lad," Mrs. Jarvis agreed, shucking off her coat and curling her cold hands thankfully around the mug. "And I noticed the devil is beginning to realize the same thing. Last year, when I first came to this hellhole, he was all for young Bill. Young Bill was the brains, the one with the get-go." Mrs. Jarvis frowned down into her mug. "And I suppose he is, really. Poor Bert's never been the same since Janice left. Poor lass, who'd stick it no more. Can't say I blame her. 20 years in this place is more than any flesh and blood can stand." Jenny measured out the oats and recalled last night's ugly little scene. "Bill doesn't seem to be in favor anymore," she commented thoughtfully. "Oh, he's all for Bert now, and takes every opportunity to jump down Bill's throat," Mrs. Jarvis agreed. "He does it on purpose, of course. Keeps them at loggerheads, I mean. All for one of them one moment, then cozying on up to the other the next. I reckon he wants his 2 sons fighting each other instead of teaming up against himself." Jenny staunchly ignored the paranoia that was building up all around her and concentrated on her porridge. "The road's clear to the village now at any rate," Mrs. Jarvis carried on chattering, but the relief in her voice was obvious. "It'll mean I can get to the shop for my Christmas stores. You don't mind if I take an hour off a little later on, do you?" Jenny had just assured her that of course she didn't mind. Besides which, it was none of her business anyway, when, from outside, came a sudden cacophony of sound that was a mixture of honk, yell, thud, and swearing. "That'll be the postman," Mrs. Jarvis said matter-of-factly. "The gander gets him every time." From above came the sound of feet clumping down the stairs, quickly followed by a lighter set of feet. Stan Kelton came in, the post in one hand, a pipe in the other. Behind him, Delia sulked her way into the kitchen, her eyes fixed on the post. As they all watched, Stan Kelton sorted through the mixture of Christmas cards and bills, and then paused, his eyes narrowing on one envelope, which was obviously a personal letter. He tossed the rest of the mail on the table, and then tore the envelope, unopened, in half, then in quarters. He turned to the fire and threw them into the flames, waiting to see them curl up and turn to ashes. When he turned, Bert was stood in the doorway. "What was that?" he asked, his face a pasty white. "Nothing that concerns you, lad," Stan Kelton said. "Sit down and have some breakfast." At the mention of breakfast, Jenny rushed her porridge, but it was simmering nicely, as if it had dare do anything else. "That was from Janice, wasn't it?" Bert persisted, as Bill sidled around him. Bill's face tightened. Bill's face tightened. "What was?" he asked, coming to his brother's aid, as if Bert was the younger and he, Bill, owed him the protection of an older sibling. "Dad threw an envelope on the fire," Delia piped up. All three Kelton children united in their mutual dislike for the man who was their father. Jenny hastily reached for some brown sugar. Porridge needed brown sugar. She did not, most definitely did not want to get mixed up in any more Kelton dramas. "Was it from Janice?" Bill asked, and stiffened as his father gave him a sneering look. "Nothing to do with you, boy. Keep your nose out." "If it was from Janice, it had nothing to do with you either," Bert said, his hands clenching and unclenching into fists by his side. "Was it from her? Was it?" he roared, goaded beyond endurance. Stan Kelton shrugged and turned to the table, ignoring Bert's pain. "Who's to say now?" He sat down and then frowned. "Hey, you, cook, what's that you doing?" Sid came into the room, the last down, and sniffed appreciatively. No doubt he would be able to manage porridge much better than a fried breakfast, and she smiled at him widely as she returned to the table with a huge saucepan of porridge in her hands. She placed it carefully onto the wooden mat she put in the center of the table. "Porridge," she said, with satisfaction. "Creamy and a little sweet, with plump sultanas and piping hot. Just what you need on a morning like this." "Porridge," Stan echoed, his eyes narrowing. "We have bacon and eggs for breakfast round here." "Oh, really?" Jenny said, her eyes widening innocently. "Sorry." "Janice always liked porridge," Bert said, his eyes still on the fire. "She must have bought some oats before she left." With that, he turned and headed for the door, going out into the cold of the day with not so much as a cup of tea to warm him up. Bill and Delia looked at one another helplessly, then joined their father at the table. Jenny, lips pressed into a grim line, dished out the porridge. Stan Kelton would just have to like it or lump it. Chapter 4. Jeremy was the last to finish his breakfast, since he'd asked for a third bowl of the delicious porridge, and when he glanced up, still licking his lips, it was to meet his father's fond eyes. For Bert had returned after about 10 minutes' absence, sat down at the table, and without a word helped himself to porridge, all the while carefully avoiding his own father's eyes. Now Jeremy grinned shyly. "Going down to the pub tonight, Dad? Before we continue with the next chapter, allow yourself this short intermission to rest your mind, I swear, and enjoy a calming melody. This story is shared freely with love. It was thank you for tuning in." Talking about the deck of 52. One of those is what I drew. I played it out like it was a clown, and baby, that was dumb. Now the western taverns where you broke my heart took me all the way up just to fall apart. The prettiest of smiles the darkest of hearts, and I was looking for some kind of feeling. Think how I'm somewhere in between. So I hate you, but I need you. I swear I'll find. See, and it's Christmas Eve and all, he added hopefully, his brown eyes shining in anticipation. A night out was obviously a rare treat for him, and Jenny marveled anew at the restricted lives that all the younger Keltons seemed to lead. Did they not realize that it was the 21st century, and that serfdom had gone out in the Middle Ages? Bert smiled and nodded, and started to say, "Why not?" when Stan Kelton, in the process of selecting his Wellingtons from the lineup of similar footwear by the door, turned sharply. "There'll be no pub crawling for you tonight, my lad," he said coldly, and thrust one foot into a depth of smelly welly. His eyes glittered as they turned on his crestfallen grandson. "Don't think I don't know why you're in such a lather to get to the Lamb and Dog, boy," he carried on, thrusting his other foot into the other Wellington, before turning back into the room, one solid mass of implacable bulk. His face, Jenny noticed curiously, was just slightly flushed. She glanced back at Jeremy, who in contrast was a stark, chalky white. Hastily she began to inspect the porridge dregs in the saucepan, relieved for once that porridge could set like concrete and required a lot of hard work and attention to remove it. She reached for the scrubbing brush and set to, vigorously. She managed to make a lot of noise as she did so, hoping that they would take the hint and leave her to work in peace. No such luck. "Leave the boy be," Bert said, but his voice was tired and limp, as if all the fight had gone out of him. Although she didn't turn to see, Jenny could just imagine the stricken, unhappy look his son must have cast his way. Obviously, there was to be no protection or help from his father. The cook wondered briefly what the lad had done to earn his grandfather's displeasure, and shook her head. What business was it of hers? Besides, as far as she could see, it didn't take much to rile Stan Kelton into making sure that you fell into line. That line being right under his thumb, of course. She began to hum loudly, something from ABBA. She'd been to see Mamma Mia at the theater last month, and the tunes were sticking maddeningly in her head. "That flighty daughter of Jack Grantley's ain't for you, boy. I've told you that before," Stan continued gruffly. "Liz Ashcroft's been making eyes at you since you went to school, and she'll inherit her dad's farm one day, what with that useless wife of his never having had any boys. If you had any sense in that head of yours, you'd make your way over there tonight and give her a Christmas present along with a kiss. You do know how to kiss, boy, don't you?" he taunted. Jeremy's head sank lower. "Ain't got her a present," he mumbled. "We'll go into town and get her one," Stan roared, running out of his meager supply of patience. "A proper one, mind, something a gal would like. I happen to know that she bought yours over a week ago." Jeremy flushed. Though naturally timid, he seemed reluctant to cower totally before his grandfather's intimidating authority, even though Stan had moved back to the table and was now towering over him. "I want to see Mandy tonight," he mumbled insistently, but even more quietly, his voice so soft it was almost inaudible. "Forget Mandy Grantley." Stan Kelton's voice, on the other hand, echoed around the stone-flagged kitchen with all the drama of a Zeus-like thunderbolt, accompanied by a lightning strike. Jeremy's neck had disappeared into his shoulders altogether when Jenny eventually turned around. Her saucepan was immaculately clean, and the table needed clearing. She thrust out her chin and walked determinedly forward. As she did so, she saw Sid reach out and pat his nephew's arm. "You go to the pub tonight, lad. If the road was clear, I'd even come with you." Stan Kelton glanced at his older brother, shook his head in contemptuous dismissal, and tramped to the door. Bert stood up heavily. "Go to the pub," he agreed briefly, and followed his father silently out of the door. There were pregnant sheep to be seen too. He'd just spent another sleepless night, and those few brief words of encouragement for his beleaguered son were all that he could muster. If Janice had been here, then together, the two of them could have protected Jeremy from his father's manipulations. But Bert knew that he lacked the strength on his own. He lacked everything, it seemed. As he left the room, tears were streaming down his face, but nobody saw them. And once outside, they quickly froze onto his face and dropped away into the snow. It was onto his face and dropped away into the snow. No doubt Delia would have echoed the same sentiments to her nephew, had she not already fled the family farm for her friend's house in the dell. Jenny had watched her go. Delia's color had been high, and her eyes were unnaturally bright. She'd wondered briefly if today was going to be the day when Delia and her other trapped friend would finally flee to London. Perhaps, Jenny had thought hopefully, watching her go from the kitchen window. Today was finally the day when Delia would not return home. She certainly looked excited enough, and was far more tense and twitchy than usual. Something was definitely in the air, and Jenny felt herself tensing up in the hopes that nothing went wrong for her. She'd only been there a day and a night, and already she couldn't wait to get away herself. But even as she gave up a little prayer for Delia, Jenny felt the onset of a deep feeling of unease. In her heart, she couldn't see any of the Keltons getting hacked from under the yoke of the farm and the man who ran it. They were too brainwashed, too beaten down, like flies trapped in a particularly viscous form of amber. Jenny sighed. Suddenly someone thumped the table with a hard walloping whack. She jumped and watched Bill push his chair away and spring to his feet. "That old sod won't be happy until we're all as miserable as he is," he gritted, his teeth clenched in fury. Sid looked up at him in alarm. "Take it easy, lad. Things'll work out, you'll see. Things will start changing around here soon. I promise you." But Bill wasn't in the mood to listen to such platitudes. Instead, he threw on his coat as if he hated it, as if he hated the whole world, in fact, and stormed out of the farm, slamming the door behind him with a vicious bang. Jenny winced as yet another blow thundered through the kitchen, and let out her breath in a wavering sigh. Forcing all thoughts of the Keltons and their problems from her mind, she set to clearing the table, giving it a good, hard, therapeutic scrub, and set about assembling the ingredients for her mince pies. She'd already made and thoroughly mixed her mincemeat last night, since she'd added a fair amount of brandy, which needed an overnight period to really soak into the raisins, sultanas, currants, orange peel, and suet. Jeremy was the last to slouch out, watched openly and anxiously by his uncle, and surreptitiously by the cook. Both of them hoped that the lad would go and see his Mandy tonight, but both of them secretly doubted that he would. When the door closed behind him, Sid sighed sadly. Jenny met his glance and raised one eyebrow, and Sid shrugged tiredly. He rubbed a hand across his forehead and leaned back in his chair, exhausted by all the various family tensions. "Stan wants Jeremy to marry Liz Ashcroft because her father owns the farm that joins our land out on the west border. Ashcroft has a fair few acres, of course. But to be fair, I suppose Liz is far more likely to make a good farmer's wife than the pub landlord's daughter anyway," Sid explained, trying to be scrupulously fair to his brother but failing miserably. Jenny put down a large empty glass mixing bowl. "Mandy is pretty, is she?" she asked bluntly, and Sid began to chuckle softly. "Like a picture." Jenny put down her wooden spoon. "Whereas Liz," she trailed off, one eyebrow raised in an invitation for him to finish the sentence. "Has a good heart," Sid obliged sadly and tellingly. The two looked at one another for a moment, then Sid sighed and rose to leave. "I'd better get on with the books. That's my job around here, all the admin. I do the form fill in and apply for the grant applications, pay the bills and order supplies and so on. It's something I can do in the warm by the fire. See? Besides, accountancy isn't our strong point. Jenny could well imagine. Minutes later, she jumped up when, from the shadows by the sink, Mrs. Jarvis came into view. Her face creased into a spiteful smile. Jenny had forgotten all about her presence. She'd kept herself very quiet and unobtrusive during the breakfast entertainment. No doubt, though, she'd been lapping it all up. Looks like the devil's family is turning against him at last, she said, nodding her head in acute satisfaction. You mark my words, they'll all leave him eventually. Just needs one to get up the nerve and the rest will go, like a line of dominoes toppling over. And serve him right too, she gloated. Jenny sighed. Mrs. Jarvis, with her tales of doom and gloom, she could do without. Mrs. Jarvis, weren't you going to go into the village to do some shopping today? She reminded her, and none too diplomatically at that. But if the deity felt any shame, she hid it well. Instead, her hands flew up to her cheeks in remembrance. La me. Yes, so I was. Oh, blast and damnation. I left my purse and shopping bag back home. She sighed angrily. I'd best go back and get it. You won't mind if I take the morning off then, she reiterated, as if desperate for reassurance or permission. But she was already walking to the door, donning her coat and muttering evilly to herself about her bad memory and the fate of devils. Jenny watched her go and hoped she didn't run into Stan Kelton on the way back to the dell. With the foul mood they were both in, one or the other of them was unlikely to survive the encounter. The first batch of 20 mince pies was in the oven by the time Stan Kelton came back. It had stopped snowing, but his hands were red and raw with the cold, and when he passed by her to check on something in the cellar, she could feel the cold coming off his clothes in shiver-making waves. She reached automatically for the mop, which she now kept outside the cupboard. Why bother keeping it inside when she was perpetually using it, she wondered peevishly, grumbling to herself as she worked. And just off to the tack room, Stan's comment stopped her in mid-mop, and she watched, totally exasperated, as he walked back across the floor in his muddy wellies. She looked at the floor and its single track of new muddy footprints, and leaned on her mop, slowly counting to 20. She balefully watched him walk to a side door she'd never seen used before, and there he took off his Wellingtons and slipped on a waiting pair of old, cracked but dry work boots. She supposed he liked to keep the stables as dry and mud-free as he could. He obviously cared more about his cart horses than he did his own home. As he disappeared into the corridor beyond, she breathed a sigh of relief. At least he was now out from under her feet, so once she'd mopped the floor again, it should be all right for a few hours at least, until everyone piled back in for lunch. Wielding the mop, she set to once more, muttering colorful curses under her breath that she'd learned from an old admiral she'd once cooked for. The range of swear words would have turned a Pimlico prostitute pink. She had prepared baked potatoes with a cheese and onion topping for lunch, and after Stan's cutting remark about her plain food yesterday, had decided to make good use of 4 of the rabbits hanging in the cold cellar to make savory rabbit with tarragon sauce for dinner. To go with it, she prepared some Duchess potatoes and braised baby vegetables. For dessert, she'd decided on apricot and ratafia tartlets, which was very posh fare indeed. Let him talk about plain food when he had that feast set before him. Although Jenny fumed silently, he'd probably then complain that the food was too fancy. At last, she could finally put away the hated mop and went to fetch the rabbits. When she came back, Sid had returned from the living room and his books and was brewing a pot of tea. Just what the doctor ordered, Jenny said, giving him a wide grin. Lifting a crock dish and finding only 2 eggs inside, however, wiped the grin right off her face. No eggs. They're kept in the chicken house, in the little lean-to leading off it, Sid told her, You can't miss it. They're next door to where the geese are kept. Jenny thought of trekking across the bare Arctic of the exposed farmyard and groaned. Don't worry, I'll have a steaming cuppa ready for you when you get back. He gave her a sympathetic grin. Jenny, once more, muttering some of the Admiral's more choice epithets under her breath, donned her coat and boots and left via the front door. She was not, definitely not, going to go out the back way and be forced to make her own wet and muddy footprint on the floor when she came back. She'd be having nightmares about that damned mop if she did. She crossed the courtyard, glad to see that one of the boys had shoveled most of the snow out of the way and piled it up against the surrounding walls. She made her way quickly past the goose shed, shivering in the icy wind, and giving the gander the evil eye as he came out hissing at her, promptly sending him hissing back again. The chickens, she saw with pleased satisfaction, were tried and true black leghorns, with a few light Sussex hens thrown in for good measure, with a handsome light Sussex cockerel to rule the roost. But to get to them, she had to battle her way through 3 feet of snow, and it was heavy going. Once in the spacious hen house, however, she tossed them some grain from the sack to save Delia the trouble when, or if, she returned from her visit to her friend. Inside the lean-to, she paused to get her breath back and give her arms a good thumping. She stamped her feet vigorously, where her circulation was loath to return. Good grief, it was cold. But that same cold weather, she was sure, had kept the eggs reasonably fresh. Nevertheless, as she found the store of stacked eggs, she carefully weighed each one. They felt cold and solid, and the shells were a good deep color. She carefully relatched the chicken house door behind her and trudged her way back to the farm's front door, taking off her boots in the dry shelter of the porch and standing them next to the door once she was inside the hall. She was glad to get out of her coat and hustle back into the warmth of her kitchen. Sid was sat with his back to her at the table, and the kettle was bubbling merrily away on the stove. "So much for having my cuppa waiting for me," she said cheerfully to him as she passed. Her mood was gradually lifting into something lighter, even happier. The taste bud arousing smell of cheese and onion permeated the room, and she had the prospect of a lavish meal to cook ahead of her. That alone was always guaranteed to make her beam. Besides, it was Christmas Eve after all. She began to hum Jingle Bells. She walked to the stove and removed the kettle. Checked that Sid had spooned a good amount of tea into the teapot. He had, and reached for the sugar. The tea made, she checked her mince pies, saw that they were nicely brined on the top, and took them out. The next batch of pies was ushered in, and Jenny quickly shut the stove door, anxious to let none of the precious heat escape. Unable ever to resist steaming hot mince pies fresh from the oven, she took down a plate and with much oohing and ouching, transferred 4 of the piping hot mince pies onto it with her bare hands. After all, who would want to eat only 1 mince pie? She turned, the teapot in one hand, the plate of mince pies in the other, and carried them triumphantly to the table and set them down. "Now, Sid, what do you make of those?" she asked, with a grin, and looked up. And her smile froze on her face. She felt her eyes widen and begin to ache, and an instant later, she felt her knees start to buckle under her. Luckily, the chair next to her was already pulled out, and she quickly clutched the table as she sank down onto the seat with a hard whomp. The table rocked a little as she did so, but she was still clinging onto it, her knuckles white with the intensity of her grip. It made Sid, whose arms were both lying limply across the tabletop, tremble just slightly. But Sid didn't feel it. Sid wasn't feeling anything at all. Jenny, her mouth as dry as the Sahara, took a deep, steadying breath and held it. She did not cry. She did not scream. For a long, long moment, she merely sat and stared at Sid, as if unable to believe what she was seeing. Like a nightmare, her mind played back the last few minutes. When she'd walked in, Sid had been sat with his back to her, his sparse hair pale in the overhead light. It had been so dark that morning, she never bothered to turn the kitchen light off. It had seemed to her then that he'd been sitting there naturally enough. Jenny swallowed hard, fighting back nausea, as she replayed in her mind the making of the tea, the transference of the mince pies, and her walk back to the table, only to confront this monstrosity. Jenny blinked and took another, even deeper, steadying breath. Sid continued to sit silently opposite her. He even seemed to be watching her, and patiently waiting. Although waiting for what, she could not have said. His eyes were open, she noticed, his mouth shut. He looked, in fact, like he always did. A teapot and mince pie steamed on the table in front of him, ready to be served. And still Sid just sat there, a long, thick-bladed knife embedded in his chest. So still, so quiet. Vaguely, through a curtain of shock, Jenny recognized the knife as one belonging to the set in the drawer by the sink. Suddenly she shuddered, her mind finally engaging into a proper gear, instead of just spinning around uselessly. What was she doing wondering about a vegetable knife when she had to? Jenny Starling took the last of her deep, steadying breaths, closed her eyes for a moment, and then opened them once more. She now felt perfectly calm. She had to get help, of course. Oh, not an ambulance or the doctor. Sid was gone far beyond all of that. But the police. Yes, she needed the police. She stood up and blinked. If there was a telephone here at Kelton Farm, she had never seen it. She suspected that Stan had probably refused to have one installed. But surely, in this day and age, somebody must have a mobile. Although in this house, she wouldn't have bet on it. For a start, she doubted that the wages Stan Kelton paid would allow anybody to be able to afford even such a minor luxury. Then she realized, but even if one of the others did have a mobile, she had no idea whereabouts on the farm they were in order to find them and ask them to use it. Then, with a mental head slap, she ran to her bag and delved inside for her own phone. Shock was definitely making her woolly-minded. To her dismay, however, there was no signal, which meant she'd have to walk into the village. Feeling stiff and disjointed, she walked to the hall, redonned her boots and coat, this time putting on her scarf and gloves, and left the farm. She still felt gloriously numb, calm, and numb. Once out of the courtyard and onto the lane, she was once more in the grip of winter's chilly hand. It never once occurred to her to seek out Stan Kelton and ask for his help. The snowbanks on either side of her were high and intimidating, covering hedge and fences alike. It was frosty, the air nipping at her nose and ears. Luckily there was no wind, she'd forgotten her hat. Funny, the things you think when the world has suddenly turned topsy-turvy on you. She had gone a little way, up to the road, before she realized that she'd automatically been plodding in the footsteps she'd made in the snow on the way up to the farm yesterday. Then, of course, she'd been coming up to the farm instead of leaving it, so she was putting the toe of her boot where her heel had once been. She began to slow down as her mind insisted there was something important she had to do. Think. Damn it, she thought grimly to herself. Think. What was it? What was wrong? And suddenly, without warning, the numbness left her, and her mind, bright, clear, and sharp, suddenly came up with the answer. It had snowed lightly in the night, and so should have obliterated the tracks made by the bottom of her boots. But in that case, Jenny stopped dead in the middle of the snowy landscape. She bent and peered more closely into the tracks she'd made yesterday, and there, clearly defined, were the ridges of another boot, one that was longer and wider than her own had been. Someone else had come to the farm since yesterday, stepping into the footprints she herself had made. Someone who'd walked up the farm road and stabbed Sid. Then, just as quickly as the thought leapt into her mind, it leapt out again. Of course someone had come that way this very morning, had in fact delivered the mail, and duly been attacked by the gander. The postman. And Sid had been alive and well, long after the postman had delivered his mail and left. Plus, of course, Mrs. Jarvis had been going to and fro. She knew she was only trying desperately to keep her mind off what had happened back at the farm, but surely that was excusable. She didn't want to think of Sid sitting there, with that obscene black handle blade his chest, his blood staining his shirt, his eyes open, and patiently waiting. Waiting. No. Far better to think of other things. She knew she wasn't operating at her best. Shock was slowing down her thinking. The way she'd panicked over the phones before remembering to try her own mobile was proof of that. It was not like her to be so incompetent. Although she was unaware that she'd walked on a fair way as she'd been thinking things through, she found herself stopping again and staring once more at the other tracks before her. The snow all around was pristine, except for the tracks left by first herself and then the postman. But what if someone had used these tracks after the postman had been and gone? If someone had come from the village to murder Sid, then she herself was eradicating the marks of their footprints with her own. And the police would certainly want to be able to take photographs of the boot prints just to make sure. Guiltily, she took a quick step sideways out of the tracks and sank her feet into nearly 3 feet of virgin snow. From now on, she would just have to wade her way through the snow and leave the tracks well alone. Anxiously, she looked up, gauging the sky. It didn't look as if it was about to snow anytime soon, but if it did, it would eradicate the tracks for sure. Carefully, and still feeling about 100 years old, she took off her scarf, selected the clearest set of boot prints she could see, and covered them with her scarf, anchoring it down in the snow so that any wind coming up wouldn't easily blow it away. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best she could do to preserve a section of the tracks. That done, she straightened painfully and began once more to plow her way stoically through the snow, stumbling now and then, mindful that there were ditches near the hedge. But even as she trudged grimly on, and at last emerged onto the main road to the village, she knew, deep in her heart, that the police would find those boot prints had been left by the postman after all, that no one from the village, or a stranger from outside the village, had made his way to Kelton Farm and killed poor Sid. A tractor had flattened the snow down on this road to the village, which meant she could walk faster. She quickly spotted the cheerful bright red splash of an old-fashioned telephone box that BT hadn't yet got around to upgrading, and made her way towards it, her breath harsh and loud in her ears. The telephone booth was flanked on one side of the road by a row of cottages, but apart from smoke pouring from their chimneys, there was no other sign of life. No doubt people were inside, doing their own Christmas baking, or were down in the center of the village, buying their last-minute groceries from the tiny village shop. She was glad to be spared the curious glances and prying questions of the locals. She stepped inside the ice-cold glass booth and lifted the receiver. But even as she did so, she was already grimly convinced that whoever had killed Sid must have come to the farm from the field, or from the direction of the dell. There was simply no getting away from it. Someone who lived or worked at Kelton Farm had killed Sid. But why? Why? Chapter 5. Jenny watched the car as it pulled to a careful halt in front of her, the front wheels sliding a little on the compacted snow still covering the road. She'd left the shelter of the telephone kiosk the moment she'd seen the car appear in the distance, and now she shivered forlornly. It had looked like a police car, even though it was a common model with no markings on it at all. The man who climbed out of the passenger seat was one of the greyest men she had ever seen. His hair, his eyes, and his coat were all grey. He was tall, lean, and so totally unremarkable that Jenny couldn't help but feel a deep pang of misgiving. Let it just be a policeman's disguise, she thought desperately, then told herself not to be such a muffin. The man was probably as brusque, lively, and efficient as any other officer of the law. First impressions, after all, were not always right. The man who emerged from behind the driver's wheel was a startling contrast. He was at least a foot shorter than his superior, and had a head of deeply ginger, riotously curly hair. Over the roof of the car, his blue eyes shone like tiny blue lumps as they quickly ran over her, assessing and missing nothing. He reminded Jenny of a Jack Russell Terrier spotting a rat. Yet another policeman emerged from the back, this one a mere lad in uniform. His eyes widened slightly as they took in Jenny's height and rounded girth and the beauty of her eyes. He looked both nervous and excited at the same time. Probably his first murder case, Jenny surmised. "Are you the woman who called a short while ago about Kelton Farm?" The tall grey inspector was the first to speak. His voice, if possible, as grey as the rest of him. It was a flat, rather unnerving monotone. Jenny nodded. "I am. Yes." She introduced herself. "I see. I'm Inspector Moulton. This is Sergeant Ford." He didn't bother to introduce the constable, who was doing his best not to look too impressed by the proceedings. She found that his eagerness made her want to just sit down and cry. She determinedly quashed the feeling. She could have a good cry later, in the privacy of her own room, she promised herself. Right now, she had to keep it together, for Sid's sake. All three policemen took a step closer to her, whether by accident or design, surrounding her on all sides, as if they were expecting her to make a bolt for it. Although where she could possibly bolt to in this weather, and in this remote area, she wasn't sure. "And what can you tell me of this incident, please?" the inspector asked, his eyes never leaving her face. Frank Moulton didn't show it, but he was a worried man. Frank never showed anything of his feelings, which was probably the main reason he'd climbed as high as he had. Had his superiors the faintest idea of the extent of his own feelings of inferiority, he'd still be directing traffic, and probably feeling a lot happier than he did now. Born and raised in a small village not 2 miles from Kidlington, where the Thames Valley Police Force had their headquarters, Frank was a countryman at heart. He had a simple soul, was basically honest and uninspired, and totally unsuited to his chosen profession. He'd walked a beat for years, quite happily nubbing poachers, the odd petty thief, and one or two of the more persistent heistbreakers. He'd become sergeant simply because he'd had enough academic competence to pass the exam, and had become inspector 10 years later via his seniority. He had never worked a murder case on his own before. No doubt the brass thought that someone with Frank's rural knowledge would be the most competent officer to handle a murder on a farm. So the phone call this morning concerning the murder of a farmer had come as a distinct and somewhat nasty shock to his system that had been tinged with just a little understandable excitement and curiosity. Nevertheless, the thought of being the senior investigating officer on a real live, so to speak, murder case was giving him a severe case of legitas. On the journey over, he'd half hoped to find some hysterical female who'd simply misread a nasty farming accident. But now, as he looked at the woman standing so patiently before him, he felt his hopes in that direction fading, and they evaporated altogether when she began to speak. "I'm working as a cook over the Christmas holidays for a Mr. Stanley Kelton and his family." She quickly ran through all the family members and a sequence of events that morning, leaving nothing out. "When I left to go to the chicken house for the eggs, Sidney was making the tea. When I came back, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a large knife embedded in his chest." She finished bluntly and succinctly, but her voice took on just the faintest hint of tremor on the final words. Sergeant Ford, who'd been taking quick and precise notes throughout, lifted his head and narrowed those laser-like eyes in her direction. She certainly sounded calm enough. Looked it, too. His eyes ran over her impressively shaped bulk. Her level, quite extraordinarily beautiful blue eyes, and noted her pallor. Yes, she was upset, but hiding it very well. Competence was written all over her. It couldn't, he thought happily, have asked for a better witness. "And where is this farm exactly?" Inspector Moulton asked, his voice betraying none of his dismay. "Back up this way." She pointed in the direction they had just come from. "The track to the farm hasn't been cleared, I'm afraid, so you won't be able to drive up there. Well, not unless you have access to a 4x4, or can get one of the other farmers to take you in his tractor, or order the council snowplow to come out here." She did, however, get into the car with them, the constable in the back having to squish up in the far corner in order to direct them to the turnoff. Once parked, they all got out and observed the two separate tracks in the snow. Jenny quickly told them about the tracks, her theory about the postman's boots, and what she had done about covering up 2 sets of prints with her scarf. As she did so, she noticed the sergeant give a very quick smile. She'd obviously done the right thing, and it made her feel a lot better. She'd half expected to be given a rocketing about tampering with evidence. She was, however, getting distinctly bad vibes from the inspector. She hoped very much that Inspector Moulton was hiding his light under a bushel. But if, as she was beginning to suspect, he didn't actually have a light to hide, she was in deep trouble. Deep trouble. Inspector Moulton told the constable to stay with the car to prevent anyone else calling at the farm, and with orders to send for Socko, scene of crime officers, forensics, and the police doctor. Now it seemed they really did have a murder on their hands. Moulton wanted as many other officials around as possible. That way, if mistakes were made, he had someone else to blame them on. The 3 of them then walked up the snow-clogged lane, stepping in the cook's second-set of footprints to the point where she had left the scarf. Moulton stared at the incongruously bright blue and red scarf lying against the snow for some while, but said nothing. He was not, in spite of his inferiority complex, actually a foolish man. He just knew from experience that the less he said, the less likely he was to dig a hole for himself that he'd need to climb out of later. They continued on until they reached the crest of the hill, at which point they paused and looked down on Kelton Farm. It looked exactly as she had remembered it from her first sight of it yesterday. Jenny realized, which was eerie. And was it only yesterday she had first come here? Felt like years now. But the farm shouldn't look the same, she thought resentfully. It should look different. A man had been killed there, brutally murdered. A nice old man who wouldn't hurt a fly. It had no business looking its usual squat, square, sturdy self. It should look dark, sad, evil. She shook her head and sighed deeply, telling herself not to be such a drama queen, causing Sergeant Ford to give her a quick, anxious look. But apart from the sigh, she made no comment, and together they walked down to the farm, Inspector Moulton making a great show of looking around the courtyard, although to what purpose, it was hard to tell. Almost everyone from the farm and the postman to boot had trampled around there, not to mention the geese and the dog. Jenny led the way into the hall and removed her boots. Guiltily, both Inspector Moulton and Sergeant Ford quickly did the same, and the cook gave a brief nod of satisfaction. At least their mothers or wives had trained them well. "This way," she said, with obvious reluctance, and they followed her across the hall to the large heavy door that opened into the kitchen. Jenny took 3 steps inside and stopped dead. A sea of Kelton faces turned her way. Bert looked haggard and was standing the nearest to her, leaning heavily against the dresser. Bill was standing by the far door, pale and tense. Delia was sobbing quietly by the sink, and Jeremy was standing by her, awkwardly patting her back. They all turned and stared at her, but it was Stan Kelton, standing just a little way from his brother's body, who reacted first. "There she is," he bellowed, and took several steps towards her, his meaty hands clenching and unclenching, as if in anticipation of closing around her throat. He stopped abruptly, as first Moulton, then Ford, emerged on either side of her, and stood surveying the scene. Without a word, and with not a hint of his reluctance or anxiety showing, Moulton walked forward and moved slowly around the chair to face Sid Kelton head-on. His grey eyes fell to the handle of the knife sticking out of the dead man's chest, and he slowly took a carefully silent but deep breath. He hadn't expected the man to be so old, or look so ill and pitiful. "Who are you lot then?" Stan asked, but from the tone of his voice, he obviously already knew. "Sergeant Ford." The sergeant pulled out some form of identification, which Stan barely glanced at, and then nodded in his superior's direction. "Inspector Moulton. And you are?" "Stan Kelton," Stan replied, his voice at last falling to something approaching a normal decibel. But it was only temporary. "What the hell's going on here?" he quickly added, his voice becoming aggrieved and downright threatening once more. "I was hoping you could tell us that, sir," Inspector Moulton said, taking the opportunity to get out of Sid Kelton's painful presence and turn his attention to the blustering younger brother. The cook had described the family well, but he had no problems picking out the family members. Nevertheless, he went through the motions of having each of them formally identify themselves. It passed the time well, and gave him time to think. Although what he was going to do next, he had only the most general of ideas. When Delia, the last to give her full name, age, and, ridiculously, address, had finished, there was a long, cold, frightening silence. Everyone looked at everyone else. Finally, predictably, it was Stan Kelton who spoke first. "Well, are you going to arrest her?" he roared, chin thrust forward, fierce brown eyes blazing. Moulton felt a rush of hope, but his voice was totally neutral as he said casually, "Arrest who, sir?" "Well, her, of course," Stan said, pointing an imperious finger in Jenny's direction. Ford looked at her quickly at this, and saw a look of exasperated contempt cross the cook's otherwise completely composed face. "We come back here," Stan Kelton continued, picking up a really good head of steam now, and find Sid. Poor Sid. His impressive voice choked a little. Sitting there. Like that. At this point, Sergeant Ford sidled around to get his first good view of the deceased, and paled slightly. As it had struck his superior a few moments before, he felt an acute wave of pity for the old man wash over him. His eyes were open, and Ford hadn't expected that. They seemed not accusing, as you might expect, but more. Ford didn't know. He had never had to investigate a murder before. He turned quickly away. Jenny noticed the policeman's unease and felt her heart sink. As time wore on, she was becoming more and more glumly certain that it was going to be left up to her yet again to sort out the whole sorry mess and unearth the identity of the killer. Stan Kelton roused himself. As I said, we found poor Sid like that, and she was the only one missing, he exclaimed impressively. And the knife's from the kitchen, and she's the only stranger here. It's obvious she did it. He finished on a flourish, but his eyes, Jenny noticed, were hot and troubled. The first genuine emotion she had ever seen in him besides anger. And in that moment, she felt genuinely sorry for Stan Kelton. It must have been a shock, even for him, finding poor Sid like that. Sid, who was his brother, his own flesh and blood after all. Her pity quickly fled, however, when she found herself the object of all eyes. Exasperated, she glanced at Moulton. But of course I was gone. I had to go to the village to phone you lot. The farm doesn't have a landline of its own, and there's no signal around here for a mobile phone. Well, not on mine anyway. What else was I supposed to do, finding poor Sid like that? Wait around here and see who might be next. She left unsaid the fact that, with a killer on the loose, she might have been forgiven for fearing for her own skin as well. Moulton looked back to Stan. Stan stared at her. Well, none of us did it, he challenged belligerently. That only leaves you. Moulton looked back at the cook. And why would I do it? She shot back just as bluntly. I've only been here one day. I've never met any of you before then. What reason would I have to kill any of you? Moulton looked back at Stan. He reminded Jenny, who was beginning to feel distinctly irritated with him, like a spectator at a tennis match. But you were the only one here. Stan was all but shouting now. Moulton looked back at the cook. You were only in the stables, Jenny reminded him flatly. Moulton looked back at Stan. Ford coughed discreetly. Stan, Moulton, and Jenny all looked at him, surprised by the interruption. Perhaps, Sergeant Ford said reasonably, it might be helpful if we establish a time frame for this, incident, Miss Starling. You told us you saw Mr. Kelton alive when you went to fetch some eggs. What time was that, would you say? Jenny, relieved that someone was making some sense at last, paused. I'd done the baked spuds for lunch, and they were half done. We'd had 11's ears. I'd say it was between 11:30 and 12. You'll have a record of my phone call, though, so we can help trace it back from that, she reminded him, and Moulton glanced at her quickly. How did a simple country cook come to know so much about police procedure, he wondered. No, Frank Moulton was not a foolish man. Just a man who knew that he was in over his head. He let the moment pass without challenging her. Time for all that later. Ford, scribbling industriously, merely nodded, having missed completely what his superior had so quickly picked up. And how long did it take you to fetch the eggs? A minute? Oh no, much longer than that, Jenny said, and ignored Stan Kelton's sour grunt of disbelief. The path to the chicken shed hadn't been cleared of snow, so I had to walk through it to get to it. Then I had to clear a big batch of snow from in front of the door with my feet before I could open it up. Then I was very careful selecting the eggs when I was there, weighing them, to make sure none of them were appled, she added, seeing Ford's puzzled glance lifting up from the notebook. There's nothing worse than the smell of rotten eggs. I had to make sure none of the eggs were light, and therefore off, before I brought them back to the kitchen. She continued the culinary lesson determinedly. Opposite her, Stan Kelton shifted restlessly. Then I fed the chickens, so that Delia wouldn't have to bother. Then I had to re-shut the lean-to door, come back, take off my boots and coat, and come back in here. I would say I was gone at the very least, 5 minutes, much closer to 10, I would have thought. Sergeant Ford, whose legs were still aching after tramping through the snow to get there, thought her assessment was probably a very accurate one. It would take some time to clear 3 foot of snow from in front of a door. I see. So what we need to know now is, where was everyone between 11:30 and 12:30? He looked up and around generally, his eyes alighting on no one in particular. I was with Sissy, Delia said at once and flushed when everyone turned to face her. Sissy Bray, my friend, I was at her house, she added, suddenly aware that in her haste to clear herself, She had come across as rather callous and selfish, even if it had been a perfectly natural impulse to do so. She was young and in shock after all. Unless she was a much cleverer actress than any of them credited. "And at what time did you return here?" Ford asked, not giving his superior so much as a glance, apparently unaware that he was subtly usurping the inspector's authority. Moulton, though, was glad to let him get on with it, and simply watch and listen. "About, I don't know, 1:15. She turned about the room until she found her brother, Bill. Bill moved from his position by the back door and nodded. "That's right. I was here then." Ford turned to him. "And what time did you get back here, sir?" Bill shrugged. "Can't say. I didn't think to look at the time. First thing I saw when I walked through the door was—" He trailed off, unable to say the words. He pointed a shaky finger in his uncle's direction. "I see," Ford said, not without sympathy. "And where had you been all morning?" "In the lower pasture, making sure there were no more trapped sheep." "Alone?" "Aye, we split up to cover more ground," Bert answered, picking up the thread of conversation with surprising authority. Without being asked, he gave his own whereabouts, about half a mile from that of his brother. "I found a ewe, but she was a goner," he added almost to himself. "I got back here, I don't know, not long after me," Bill confirmed thoughtfully. "If you remember, you asked me what I was standing around for like a spare scarecrow." He reminded his brother. Bert nodded. "That's right. And then I saw Uncle Sid as well. Now I think about it, I saw you going in just as I was coming down the footpath," Bert added quickly. "You couldn't have been here more than a minute or two before me. I left the ewe on the side of the footpath about quarter of an hour after I heard the church clock strike 12. It must have taken me another 15 minutes to get here." "About 12:30 then?" Sergeant Ford probed carefully. "For both of you?" "Aye," Bert nodded. "What happened then, after you arrived?" "I went to fetch Dad," Bill said. "I knew he was working in the tack room. We're going to need the horses soon. A thaw's on the way," he added, apropos of nothing. Nobody asked why the horses would be needed, or how he knew that there was a thaw on the way. Country folk knew about weather, and nobody in the room was interested in horses just then. "I came in through this door." Stan picked up the story at this point, and nodded to the side door that was still standing open to the dark corridor beyond, just as Delia came in through the back door. "I wasn't in time to supper seeing." Delia began to cry again. In the warm, quiet room, her sobs echoed eerily. It was an ancient sound, reminding the cook of just how many women, through the ages, had cried for their menfolk who'd been killed without reason. "Do you want to go upstairs, Dee Dee?" Jeremy murmured, half taking her arm in an effort to prise her away. "And you, sir?" Sergeant her away. "And you, sir?" Sergeant Ford said quickly, realizing that Jeremy was the only one yet to give an account of himself. "Jeremy was the last of all of us to get back here." Bert quickly leapt to his son's defense. Perhaps too quickly, Jenny thought curiously. Bert had also been anxious to point out that his brother had arrived only moments before he had. Why did he feel the need to protect so many, unless he believed they needed it? Yes, Bert Kelton, for one, didn't believe his father's accusations against the cook. Interesting that, Jenny thought. Very interesting. "And where had you been all morning?" Ford asked the youngster, with no particular emphasis. But again, before Jeremy could open his mouth, his father leapt in. "Up at the far corner of Dingle Field," he said quickly. "That's over near Ashcroft's place, as far from here as you can get on our property." He made it a point to draw their attention to the fact. "He was taking some winter feed to the yearling rams we've got up there. Need to keep them fat for market," he added. But again, no one was interested in the livestock. "I see." It was Moulton who said the words, but Jenny was beginning to wonder if he saw at all. "Ford did. She certainly did. Any one of them could have done it. Bert, Bill, and Jeremy were all alone. Any of them could have come back to the farm, watching and waiting for an opportunity, then observed the cook leaving for the henhouse and crept into the kitchen to kill Sid. Then it was just a question of quickly making their way back to the fields, only to return at lunchtime all innocent and seemingly unknowing. Delia might have the best alibi of all. If her friend and her friend's mother, Cordelia Bray, could assure them that Delia had been in their sight all morning. Stan Kelton, working in the tack room, was the nearest on the spot of all of them, and, to police eyes, she herself was right on the spot as well. Nobody at all had an alibi. Chapter 6. Detective Chief Inspector Bryant arrived with a small army of men less than half an hour later. A small man. He had a small man's bluster, amply backed up by a large mustache, and a suit that Sergeant Ford would never have been able to afford if he'd lived on bread and water for a month. "So, Moulton," the chief inspector said, rubbing his hands together briskly and peering carefully at Sid Kelton's body, which hadn't yet been either moved or touched. "Looks like a pretty nasty but straightforward business." Which was somewhat unhelpful, Jenny privately thought, but had more sense than to say. Moulton nodded obediently, if a shade dubiously. Although he rather doubted the accuracy of his superior's summation, he was, nevertheless, the only one present to actively welcome his officious and pompous company. With the chief inspector on the scene, he felt that heat was of himself. Also, he thought. "What's the story so far, then?" Bryant asked with ghoulish relish, his little button eyes snapping around the room, resting on each member of the Kelton family in turn. He seemed to be buzzing with thought and speculation, and Jenny felt her spirits finally lift a little. At least the man had a bit of get-up-and-go about him. The sheepdog, which was obviously unnerved by all the activity, and on hearing yet another stranger's voice in the midst of his territory, chose that moment to decide that he really couldn't keep quiet any longer, and let out an ear-piercing bark. At the same time, he jumped down from the seat under the table and proceeded to give Bryant's ankle a thorough sniffing. The dapper chief inspector leapt back as if he'd been shot. "You great hairy miserable dollop," he squeaked, although no doubt he'd meant it to come out as a leonine roar. He hopped nervously from foot to foot and scowled down at the animal ferociously. Not a particularly dog-friendly sort of man, the chief inspector, Jenny mused, hiding a smile behind her hand and pretending to smother a cough. The sheepdog, never having heard a human being make quite that sort of noise before, looked up at him curiously, head turned to one side, ears pricked up in interest. Perhaps he'd do it again. Bert stepped forward without a word and grabbed the dog by the collar. The mutt tenaciously dug all 4 sets of claws into the flagstones as best he could, guessing, quite accurately, that he was about to be turfed out ignominiously on his ear. His claws scraped gratingly across the floor as Bert pulled him to the door and neatly ejected him. Bryant straightened his tie and pretended his dignity had not been severely ruffled. Taking the cue, Moulton nodded at Ford. "Sergeant Ford, read back the initial statements, please," he ordered, a past master in how to pass the buck without seeming to. But Ford related the events without mishap, even managing to make it sound as if he'd covered much more ground than he actually had, in the half an hour or so that had been made available to him. Inspector Moulton was not the only one who knew how to deal with the top brass. In a corner, trying to appear as inconspicuous as possible, not an easy feat to be sure considering her size and visual impact, Jenny watched and listened, her heart sinking ever deeper into her boots. If Moulton had failed to fill her with confidence, Chief Inspector Bryant was now filling her with downright foreboding. Unless she was mistaken, He was showing all the signs of a rat about to desert a sinking ship, and her gloom was quickly vindicated. "Right. Well, I can see you have everything under control," Bryant said, much to Moulton's utter dismay. "Needless to say, we're going to keep on this till we have a result." Bryant turned quickly, spearing his underling with a gimlet glance, checking for any sign of rebellion. But although Moulton could have matched Jenny Starling, misery for misery, not a flicker of it showed on his face. "Of course, sir," he said, voice as bland as milk. Bryant's tense little shoulders relaxed and he nodded. "Good man, Moulton." He might not have many high-ranking cases under his belt, but it was clear that nothing fazed him. And clearly, the man was far more at home in this kind of environment than himself. That damn dog with his muddy paws. Another moment and it would have stuck its nose in his crotch, no doubt. He looked at his watch. "Right. The boy should have taken casts from those footprints by now," he said, and mumbled rather reluctantly, "Good thinking that, Moulton." The scarf, it showed initiative. Sergeant Ford cast a quick, guilty glance at Jenny, but Moulton was already taking the credit with a dry, "Thank you, sir. I do my best." Bryant bristled out as energetically as he'd bristled in. Stan Kelton, who'd remained narrow-eyed and stiff-lipped throughout, let out a snort as the door closed behind him. Fat law good he was, he snarled. Nobody for once disagreed with him. The police surgeon arrived just as Bryant exited and walked straight in to examine the body, not even glancing at the silent assembly. As he touched Sid's neck and officially proclaimed him dead, Delia made a small sound and fainted. Luckily, Jeremy was on hand to catch her. The doctor, a fat-faced individual in his early 60s, looked up from the body inside, but not totally without sympathy. Delia was a pretty young girl after all, and looked a pitiable sight, lying limply in her nephew's strong arms. "Better take her upstairs. Sleep's the best thing for shock. Make sure you cover her, with plenty of blankets, mind," he added, and gave the young lad an encouraging smile. "Oh, bless all get out of here," Stan Kelton said heavily, and for once his sons were quick to comply. In the living room, they huddled around the fire, each and every one of them studiously avoiding looking at the set of accountancy books that Sid had been working on just a few hours ago. It was still lying around, haphazardly, on the small coffee table next to his favorite armchair, as if expecting him to come back any moment and take up where he had left off. And the fact that he would now never be able to do so, he had left off. And the fact that he would now never be able to do so made a lump rise to more than one throat. Jenny remained in the kitchen, watching everything. For one thing, it was her domain, and she'd have felt out of place in the living room with the rest of the family. For another, she was curious to see if the doctor found anything abnormal during his initial examination. Although what that might be, she had, as of that moment, no idea. Apparently there was nothing to catch his attention, and within the hour, the police team had bagged the knife, which the doctor had carefully removed, and had collected several small bits and pieces that would be taken away for analysis. Finally, 2 sturdy constables came and carried the body away. Jenny supposed they would be having trouble getting a mortuary van out to the farm. Not for the first time she cursed the snow that was keeping the Kelton home so isolated. Without Sid, the room seemed strangely empty. As the last of them left, Jenny finally roused herself. "Can I clean the floor now?" she asked, looking around the filthy floor and already reaching automatically for the mop. Moulton jumped, having forgotten that she was there, and then looked down at the floor. He frowned. "Yes," he said reluctantly and uncertainly, elongating the word as he did so. He'd seen for himself a team of men search the floor and pick up the odd piece of frozen mud, and there was nothing to be discovered from the muddy footprints themselves, that was for sure. The Kelton family and half the Thames Valley police force had trampled all over the kitchen floor that morning. Still, he didn't like it. He didn't like making decisions at all, not even the small ones. Jenny picked up the mop and set to. She felt utterly depressed. "I shall need your full name and current address, madam," Ford said, for the first time realizing that he hadn't asked her for the information before. When she'd introduced herself at the telephone kiosk, she'd only referred to herself as Miss Starling, and both men had more or less promptly forgotten it in the current excitement. He shot Moulton a guilty look. Jenny, her mopping finished, sighed deeply. Her parents had run true to type in the eccentricity of forenames for their only child. "My name," she said firmly, "is Miss Jennifer Zenobia Lucretia Minerva Starling." She added the address of her little bedsit as an afterthought. She doubted she'd be staying there for long anyway. Both Moulton and Ford were staring at her openly now, her simple introduction more than enough to make them both gape. Moulton, in particular, felt like falling to his knees and kissing her feet, but thankfully restrained himself. "Miss Jenny Starling," he repeated, hardly able to believe his luck. "You, are the same Jenny Starling who had a hand in helping to solve that nasty poisoning business at a birthday party last summer on you?" He just managed to contain a whoop of joy as she nodded reluctantly. "And you solved that locked room murder case the year before, right?" Sergeant Ford piped up. Again, the cook nodded reluctantly. "I did have the pleasure of helping some people out of a bit of a tight spot, yes," she said, in massive understatement. "Splendid," Moulton said happily. He didn't add anything else, but then, he didn't need to. Jenny glanced at Sergeant Ford to see if he shared his superior's unusual enthusiasm. Ford, though, was frowning, and it was a very familiar sort of frown indeed to the unhappy cook. She'd seen it on many a policeman's face in the past, which was not surprising really, since she had it on good authority that her name was now famous, or more accurately, infamous, in police circles. Nobody liked a busybody around to muddle up his own investigation, even if she did have a very disconcerting habit of being useful at times. It all smacked too closely of popular detective fiction for most coppers to stomach. Usually, Jenny made it her practice to avoid policemen, who in turn were very grateful for her efforts in this direction. But Moulton, it seemed, was going to prove the exception to the rule, as his very next words showed. "So, Miss Starling, what do we do next?" She was just about to open her mouth and say that she didn't particularly want to do anything next, when the door opened on a blast of cold air and Mrs. Jarvis bustled in. "Oh, but that's cold out there. Mind if I have a cuppa before I go on to the village?" Her voice trailed off as she took in the presence of the two strangers and, for the first time, sensed the unmistakable odor of tragedy in the air. Her appearance on the scene gave Jenny the sudden and disorientating sensation that she was in the middle of a not particularly good farce. She almost expected an unseen audience to laugh and applaud at this entrance of the light comic relief. "Whatever's the matter?" Mrs. Jarvis said in alarm, pulling off her bubble hat, and her cheeks turning rosy red in the warm air of the kitchen. "Who are you, madam, if I might ask?" Ford leapt in, notebook in hand. "Well, I'm Mrs. Jarvis, of course," she said, as if she suspected Ford fell little short of a Toc H lump in the brightness stakes. "She's the daily here," Jenny explained quietly. "What's wrong?" Mrs. Jarvis demanded sharply, her lower lip beginning to tremble. "You're the police, ain't ya?" she challenged with her hands on her hips, her voice defying them to deny it. "We are, madam. I'm sorry to say that Mr. Kelton has been murdered. Would you mind telling me where you've been this morning?" Ford tried again. Mrs. Jarvis's jaw dropped for a moment, and then her eyes began to glitter. A wide and unpleasant smile quickly curved along her face. Both policemen began to stare at her in astonishment. "No, Mrs. Jarvis, that's not it," Jenny said sharply, understanding that smile and the meaning behind it all too well. "It wasn't Stan," she added quickly, then added more quietly, her voice bleak. "It was Sid." Mrs. Jarvis gasped once, went white, and tumbled onto a chair, one hand pressed against her skinny bosom. "Sid?" she whispered. "Oh no, not Sid," she all but wailed. "No, that can't be. It's the devil. He should have been the one killed," she mumbled, in her state of shock and confusion, seeming not to care that Sergeant Ford was writing down every incriminating word she said. She suddenly sat up straight, her nostrils flaring. "Who did it? Which dirty dog did it?" Suddenly she shot up to her feet again, the chair wobbling behind her and finally falling to the floor, the crash it made sounding loud and harsh in the quietness of the room. "It was him, wasn't it?" she breathed, her eyes going alarmingly round and wide. "He did it. The devil." Sergeant Ford frowned over his notes. What had started out as a promisingly unusual reaction from a potential suspect looked to be turning out into nothing more than the ravings of a religious lunatic. "We don't know who did it, Mrs. Jarvis," Jenny said warningly, but the Daily was having none of it. She turned to Moulton, instinctively picking him out as the one with superior rank. "You must arrest him, right now." Moulton coughed into his fist. "I doubt if even the chief constable himself has the power to arrest the devil, madam," he responded deadpan. "Not the real devil, you idiot," Mrs. Jarvis said, almost jumping up and down on the spot in frustration. "I mean him, Stanley." Ford and Moulton exchanged uneasy but speculative glances. Jenny shook her head and sighed. She was getting one mother and father of a headache. "What makes you think Mr. Stanley Kelton killed his brother, Mrs. Jarvis?" Ford asked, his tone so reasonable that it made Jenny's teeth grate together. "It stands to reason, don't it?" Mrs. Jarvis said, her tone getting higher and higher as she stared from policeman to policeman. "How dense can you be?" she wailed, her Oxfordshire old country accent becoming ever thicker as she became more and more distressed. "That man's the devil himself. He cares about nothing and no one. He thinks he's above everyone and everything." At last, sensing that she might be making a bit of a fool of herself, Mrs. Jarvis trailed off. She looked at the policeman for several minutes, breathing deeply. Then she slowly sat down once more. Eventually, she looked across at the cook. "Well, it has to be him," she insisted petulantly. "It has to be," she repeated in a hiss, although Jenny had offered no adverse comment. "You mark my words," she rallied a bit, "when all's done and dusted, it'll turn out to have been that devil what done it." Then an astonishing look of cunning crossed her face. "Or was responsible for it anyhow," she added, somewhat more cryptically. Jenny couldn't help but feel a great deal of sympathy for her. If one of the inhabitants at Kelton Farm was the murderer, and who else could have done it, she too hoped that it was Stan Kelton. But, she wondered bleakly, wasn't that just the alternate in wishful thinking? At this point, there was no more reason to suspect Stan than anybody else. She'd have to be careful and not let her own dislike of the man color her judgment, she told herself firmly. What she needed now was to keep a clear and level head, and she certainly couldn't rely on any help from Mrs. Jarvis in maintaining it. "What did you do after leaving here this morning, Mrs. Jarvis?" she asked quietly instead, and from the corner of her eye, saw Sergeant Ford bristle. She was obviously trespassing on his terrain now, but it couldn't be helped. She had a better insight into the interrelationships seething around the Kelton farm than either policeman, which gave her an unfair advantage. Luckily, The sergeant made no comment, but Julie jotted down Mrs. Jarvis's story quickly and concisely, contenting himself with just the odd, fulminating look in the cook's direction. Mrs. Jarvis, it seemed, had returned home for her purse, stopped to make herself some lunch, and then decided to pop in for a cup at the farm before going on to the village. What she didn't admit to, or what all of them knew, was that she'd been deliberately dragging her feet, so to speak, because it was Christmas Eve, and she resented having to work it at all. As an alibi, it was no better than anybody else's. She could have returned at any time and killed Sid. With her story told, she seemed reluctant to leave. Such was her curiosity. And it was Moulton who finally had to more or less manhandle the daily out of the kitchen and send her on her way to the village to do her postponed bit of shopping. And once she'd arrived there, they all knew that she'd make it her business to spread the gossip as quickly and as self-importantly as possible. "I take it you've got a search party out, scouting for any footprints leading to the farm across the fields from the village," Jenny said, as the room once more fell silent. Moulton blinked. Jenny sighed. "With all that snow lying around, we should make sure no one came here from the village or from the main road. Whilst I don't think it likely that a stranger did kill Sid, it's probably a good idea to eliminate all other possibilities first," she explained, feeling unutterably weary. Without a word, Moulton left, no doubt to give the order for a team of constables to start scouring the fields for tracks. Ford glanced at her, something approaching respect in his eyes. He was beginning to think she might prove to be useful after all. He was used to doing Moulton's thinking for him, and he had to admit that, like his superior, he too had begun to feel a little out of his depth in this case. It was nice to have an old hand, so to speak, hanging around, even if in a strictly unofficial capacity, of course. "So, you think it was an inside job then?" he asked, as his superior returned. "I'm afraid so," Jenny agreed wearily, "especially since the dog was here all the time. I've forgotten about Pooch," she admitted. If a stranger had done it, then surely Sid would have showed some surprise, some alarm. The dog would have barked at the very least, and I'm sure Pooch would have attacked any stranger that went for his master. And I heard no such rumpus. She thought of Sid, fondling the dog's ears. Pooch would wonder where that kind hand had got to in the weeks to come. The thought threatened to bring tears to her eyes, and she briskly shook her head and snapped out of it. Getting maudlin. That's what it amounted to, so she'd better watch it. She glanced up as Ford put away his notebook, the gesture reminding her of someone else. Who? Of course, Philip Endicott. When she'd reached the age of 21, her father had become convinced that his only child would die an old maid unless he did something about it. Consequently, he'd hinted, bullied, cajoled, and whinged until she and Philip Endicott, a turf accountant from Banbury, had finally agreed to become engaged. Philip had fallen in love with her Yorkshire puddings and jam roly-poly. Or was it her bread and butter pudding? Of course, Jenny had had no serious intention of marrying anyone at such a young age, let alone Philip Endicott. But agreeing to the pretense had kept her father quiet, and, in the end, once his hysteria had worn off somewhat, it had been easy enough to convince Philip that he really didn't want to marry her either, divine Yorkshire puddings or not. Funny, the last she'd heard, Philip Endicott had joined a monastery in deepest Peru. She frowned thoughtfully. Surely she hadn't scared him that much. Although, now she came to think of it, she had threatened to do something very physical with a spatula unless he stopped bothering her. The starling, Moulton's raised voice snapped her out of her reverie. She blinked and straightened up. "What?" she asked briskly. "I was saying," Moulton explained patiently, "that the men are searching the fields now. The body's gone, and everything's quietened down." Jenny said flatly. But Moulton was not a man to be easily put off. He'd found his salvation and was going to cling to it tenaciously come what may. "So what do you suggest we do next?" he prodded. The cook looked at him thoughtfully. Never before has she been called upon to take such a direct part in a murder investigation. Usually, she spent much of her time assuring the policeman in charge that she had no intention of interfering. Now, faced with Moulton's patiently waiting face, she felt a sudden blast of panic. What if she couldn't do it? What if Sid's murderer got away with it? No. Such a thought was unthinkable. Jenny Starling visibly stiffened her shoulders, which made Moulton at least feel much happier about things. "Well," she said practically, "if we can't do anything positive yet, we can at least see if we can rule out Delia from the list of suspects," she said firmly. Moulton looked blank for a moment, then said, "We go and see Sissy Bray and her mother." "Right," Jenny said. "And, Inspector, we'll all go out the front way, if you don't mind. I'd rather we got into the habit of coming and going that way. It'll save me from spending my entire time mopping the floor." Chapter 7. Cordelia Bray didn't look like much of an invalid, although Jenny had to admit that she certainly knew how to be one. But the cook found herself instantly agreeing with Mrs. Jarvis's rather spiteful opinion of her next-door neighbor within moments of meeting her. A well-cushioned woman, she lay on a long, comfortable sofa and was dressed in a cozy, warm-looking dressing gown and slippers, next to a roaring log fire. By her side was a table on which rested an empty teacup, bowl of fruit, a box of chocolates, and several popular women's magazines. Her hair had been carefully washed and brushed, and was still more golden than gray. Her lips were colored with a very discreet lipstick, and her face powdered to a becoming pink. Since she couldn't have been expecting visitors, and thus must repose beautifully like this all day long, it was obvious that her appearance meant even more to Cordelia than her supposed ill health. Her voice was decidedly weak, though, as was the look in her eye, as she made a feeble attempt to sit up a little straighter. Now, was that simply play acting, or a case of genuine lethargy, Jenny wondered, with just a touch of unease. She supposed that if you played the invalid for long enough, and didn't exercise or use your muscles much, then someday you might very well discover that you'd become an invalid in reality. The thought was rather horrific. "Sissy, did you say these were the police?" she breathed, her eyes widening in alarm, her hands fluttering in panic. Jenny wasn't sure if the pike was real, either, or if Mrs. Bray merely thought that it was the done thing to do when your daughter ushered in such unexpected visitors to your living room. In contrast to her mother, Sissy Bray looked the epitome of wholesome health and youth. She was Delia's age, but rather more plain and serious in her manner than her friend, and she hovered about the room as if unsure of what to do next. Jenny could well imagine that apart from Delia, there were very few callers at their cottage. Apart from anything else, it was in such an isolated spot, with a mere footpath leading to the dell from Kelton Farm. No car could be driven right up to the front door, and in this day and age, she cynically expected that fact alone would put off a lot of would-be callers anyway. She doubted that the green message, i.e. cycle or walk, counted for much in this small rural community. As the girl, all gangly arms and legs, finally decided to settle on the arm of a huge padded armchair, Jenny wondered with sympathy if the very isolation of her home added to the girl's obvious desperation to escape from it. "I'm Inspector Moulton, Mrs. Bray," the inspector began gently, responding as most men would to the sight of a supposedly helpless, quite good-looking female. He even managed a smile. Ford actually blushed as Cordelia swept her eyes briefly over him. Please, gentlemen, do sit down. I'm afraid I can't rise." Both men fell over themselves to assure her that she mustn't upset herself, and Cordelia sank graciously back against the pale mint-green cushions that complemented her coloring so well. "Sissy, you must make some nice hot tea for our callers. The weather's so foul, isn't it? Of course, it's nice to have snow for Christmas for a change, but... oh dear." She gave a lovely little shudder that rocked her ample bosom just nicely, and then sighed deeply. "So much of it. I swear, I think we'll be snowed in here for weeks." Moulton murmured, vaguely tut-tutting condolences and assurances, whilst Ford, somewhat reluctantly it seemed, reached for his notebook. Her performance over for the moment, Cordelia finally gave her female visitor a quick scrutiny. Her eyes were faintly contemptuous as they took in her unusual height and well-endowed hourglass figure. But her gaze sharpened, and then she took in a quick gasp of air as she met Jenny's eyes. Not only were they far more beautiful than her own, but they were looking at her as if they could see right through her. Cordelia quickly looked away. She coughed gently. "Well, gentlemen, I must say I didn't expect to ever entertain a policeman in my home. There's nothing wrong, is there?" At that moment, Sissy returned with a tray. She had been so quick, the cook instantly surmised two things. One was obvious. The poor girl had to keep her kettle constantly on the go to have a steady supply of hot water ready. And secondly, she didn't like to be out of earshot for any longer than was strictly necessary. That, Jenny supposed, could be put down to simple curiosity. And again, perhaps the girl didn't trust her mother to be alone with them. And if that was the case, what was it she was afraid of that Cordelia might say? Jenny watched the teenager closely as she stirred the tea. It had been a cold walk from Kelton Farm to the dell, and the prospect of hot tea was more than welcome. Sissy had none of Delia's natural poise or grace, she noted clinically. But even so, she seemed to pour out the tea in jerks and nervous starts that went far beyond the fumbling of an awkward teenager. She was obviously tense and on edge about something, but that might just be put down to the alien presence of the police in her living room. Ford helped himself to 2 lumps of sugar. Moulton had 1. Jenny took her own cup from the girl and smiled at her encouragingly. She got absolutely no response. It was as if the girl barely knew she was there. She's definitely nervous about something, Jenny thought uneasily, and suddenly had a very strong premonition that this interview was not going to give them the results she'd been hoping for. "Now, Mrs. Bray," Moulton began, "I'm afraid there's been a little trouble over at Kelton Farm," he admitted, and Sissy's cup rattled noisily in her saucer. She quickly picked up the cup and took a sip, but nobody in the room had missed the telltale reaction. Her mother cast her a quick, black look. It boded badly for Sissy later on, Jenny thought. Mother was going to lay down a riot act about something and no mistake. Now, though, and mindful of her visitors, she merely lifted one delicately arched eyebrow and tried not to look too curious. "Oh, well, I've never been over there, of course. I'm completely housebound, I'm afraid, so I don't quite see." As delicately as she could, she urged them to get to the point. She wants to get her daughter alone as quickly as possible, Jenny thought in quick comprehension, and felt her sympathy for the girl grow in leaps and bounds. Mrs. Bray's stranglehold on her only child had to be protected at all costs. Jenny could well understand why she would deem any news, no matter how seemingly irrelevant, as a possible threat to her cozy life here in the dell. "Yes. Well, it's Delia Kelton we actually want to talk to you about," Moulton said. He was not about to tell the charming and unfortunate Mrs. Bray all about the murder. It was hardly police policy to go about dispersing information to the general public, but he did need to get to the facts. Cordelia shot her daughter a fulminating look. Yes, well, I don't think I should say much about Telia, she began sweetly. You see, I don't really approve of the girl, she carried on, fluttering her hands helplessly. I'll just bet you don't, Jenny thought grimly. She was too much of a disruptive influence on Sissy, no doubt, and too dangerous by half, with all her ideas of running away and maybe sharing a flat together and getting a job and becoming free of their respective prisons and prisoners. So I wouldn't want anything I say to color your, judgment, so to speak. Cordelia was finishing, so reasonably, and with such impeccable fairness, that Jenny shot her a quick look. She thinks something's happened to Delia, the cook realized with sudden comprehension. Now why would she think that? Oh, of course not. But really, all we need to know, Moulton rushed to assure her, is whether or not Delia came here this morning, and if so, how long she stayed for. Oh, Cordelia said, sounding, to Jenny's ears at least, a trifle disappointed. Yes, she did come this morning. About what time, Sissy? She turned to her daughter, who was staring down with intense interest into her cup. Sissy raised and lowered her shoulders sullenly. I dunno, just after breakfast, about 9. Ford meticulously scribbled down a note of the time. And what time did she leave, do you think, Miss Bray? He prompted her softly. Again, the teenager's shoulders rose and fell in silent misery. I dunno, Bray. I dunno. Just before lunch. Suddenly, Sissy lifted her eyes and stared straight at her mother. She's not allowed to eat here, you see. She has to go home for lunch. Her voice, although even and steady, spoke volumes. Cordelia flushed angrily then, aware of her audience, half turned to the 2 policemen sitting opposite her, and opened her eyes piteously wide. The young these days don't understand about hardship, Inspector. You see, I only have my widow's pension, and with the price of food these days, her hands did a helpless butterfly act. I simply couldn't afford to. Well, you know, she said, her voice wavering slightly, her head dipping in very seemly humility. But the Keltons, of course, are really quite wealthy. Oh, quite of course, Moulton said, and cast an angry glance at Sissy. Children nowadays don't have much idea about the importance of money, he agreed, his voice chilly. Ha! Jenny could restrain herself no longer. She was pretty sure that Sissy Bray knew an awful lot about the hardships of life. Both men turned to stare at her, surprised by her snort of disbelief. Cordelia watched her teacup with as much industrious concentration as Sissy had previously been watching hers. Aware that she now held center stage and had no one to blame for it but herself, she gave a small cough. I take it that Delia stayed in here most of the time, Mrs. Bray, she said, and when the woman shot her a puzzled look, nodded around the room. In the living room, I mean. Oh, I see. No, as a matter of fact, Sissy always takes Delia upstairs to her bedroom, she said, her voice dripping with disapproval. She keeps her magazines up there, you see, and her stereo and that dreadful computer that she's always on day and night. You know how silly girls are, with their fashion magazines and pop stars and things, she said, not to Jenny, but to Moulton. In Cordelia's world, it was obviously only the men that mattered. I see, Jenny said, her voice droll, and turned to Sissy. Miss Bray, did Delia leave your room for any length of time during the morning? Sissy was now looking distinctly puzzled. Leave? No, I don't think so. Of course, I had to keep popping downstairs to see Mum, she said, and the cook nodded wisely. Yes, I'll just bet you did, you poor chump, she thought grimly. But apart from that, you were together all morning, she persisted, beginning to feel relieved that at least one Kelton was now properly out of the running for the murder of poor Sid. The sissy was nodding, even as Cordelia was shaking her head. "Don't forget my bath, darling," she reminded, her voice sweetness itself. She didn't know why, but Delia Kelton was in some kind of trouble, and that was too good an opportunity to miss for someone like Mrs. Bray. Jenny glanced to her briefly, then turned back to her daughter as the girl sighed heavily. "Oh yes, I had to give Mum a bath." "When was this?" Ford piped up, his ever-ready notebook quivering in his hand. "Just before lunch," Sissy said. "I remember because when I got back me and Dee Dee didn't have much time left to talk." And the fact that Sissy had desperately wanted to talk to her friend Jenny didn't doubt. For Sissy still looked the epitome of misery. Had Delia stormed out after some kind of argument? Sissy seemed to be regretting something, but what exactly? And surely a spat between young friends could have nothing to do with Sid Kelton and his death. "How long do you think did it take you to give your mother her bath?" she asked gently, and Sissy shrugged. "I dunno. Half an hour or so, I should think. It takes a while to run the water just right and get Mum in and everything." "Sissy," Cordelia said, glancing quickly at the men. "You think that's enough?" Moulton shifted uneasily in his chair. He too had no wish to go into details about poor Mrs. Bray's ablutions. "And this was just before lunch," Jenny said. "Say, 1 o'clock?" she asked hopefully. But her luck was out. "Oh no," Sissy said quickly. "We usually eat around 12:30. So Delia had been alone when Sid was killed, and had been alone for a good half an hour or so. Plenty of time to go to the farm and come back again. And she'd have known, from her past experiences at the Dell, roughly how long it would take Sissy to bathe her mother. Damn. Opposite her, both policemen were thinking much the same thing. Ford glanced at Moulton, who reluctantly rose to his feet. "And you never popped back into your bedroom for something, even once, and saw Delia?" Jenny fished, just to make sure. The sissy was already shaking her head. "I daren't leave Mother alone in the bath," she said simply. Jenny nodded and sighed. And of course, Delia would know that as well. So that was that. Sissy rose to see them act, but once on the doorstep, she quickly grabbed Jenny's arm. Moulton and Ford were already making off down the footpath, not anxious to linger on the cold doorstep. A chill wind was springing up in the east. "I hope she makes it," Sissy hissed, her voice rich in defiance, and Jenny met her dancing eyes with a sad look. For with those few simple words, she understood at once what Sissy was thinking, what she had been thinking all throughout the interview. "Delia hasn't left home, Sissy," she said quietly. "It isn't about that." Sissy's small mouth fell open, her color ebbing away. "But I thought that horrible father of hers had brought the police in to find her." Jenny shook her head. "I'm afraid not." She looked behind her and saw Ford and Moulton had stopped, realizing that she was not following. Quickly, before one or the other of them started coming back, Jenny said quietly, "You and she were planning to leave today, weren't you?" Sissy automatically glanced over her shoulder, back into the house, no doubt expecting her mother's accusing presence to loom over her at any moment. Then she glanced back at the big cook and nodded miserably. "Tell her I'm sorry, will you? But she already knows Mum found my money. I told her it was gone." From inside the house, Cordelia called her daughter's name imperiously. The girl reacted as if to a whiplash. "I must go," she said, and turned back. Then she hesitated. She looked back over her shoulder one last time and said quietly, "If Dee Dee didn't leave, is she in any trouble?" Jenny nodded slowly. "I think she may be, yes," she said quietly. Behind her came the crunch of feet in the snow, and Sissy quickly retreated and shut the door. When Jenny turned back, both policemen were standing in front of her, looking curious. "Well?" Moulton said. She shrugged. "Delia and Sissy had planned on leaving home today," she said quietly. "But something went wrong. She would rather not have given the girls away, but she'd learned before, from bitter past experience, that anything in a murder inquiry might turn out to be important, no matter how unrelated it might seem at the time. She'd also learned that it wasn't particularly clever to keep things from the police. They tended to be just a bit touchy about it." Moulton frowned. She was going to leave her mother, all alone in the state she's in, and on Christmas Eve of all days. Moulton sounded shocked out of his boots. Jenny stared at him for a moment, and sighed heavily. She said nothing, however. She was used to the stupidity of men. Back at the farm, everyone except Delia was sitting around the kitchen table. The remains of the baked potatoes with cheese and onion topping littered the surface, though very little of it had actually been eaten. Still, she mused, it was better than leaving it in the oven to burn. She cleared it up without comment. She had dinner to cook, which would have to be a little later than usual. Not that she expected that anyone would complain under the circumstances. Bill and Bert sat morosely silent, as if still unable to believe what had happened to their uncle. No doubt it was only Sid's kind and peacekeeping presence that had made life tolerable for them both at Kelton Farm. But now, with him gone, the future must look bleak indeed. Jeremy looked nervous. He fiddled with a slice of bread, spreading crumbs around and casting his father quick, worried glances. Stan Kelton cleared his throat. "I know it's Christmas tomorrow," he began, his voice gruff. "And if you coppers want to get back to your families, you can," he agreed, magnanimously, as if he really had any say in it. "But if you want to stay here the night, that can be arranged as well. There's 2 rooms you can have. Bill can light you a fire in each if you like. If you don't, you'd best be going now. There's another snow squall on the way." Ford looked longingly at his superior. He was married with 2 kiddies under 5. He had to get home to read them a story, and later on, creep into their room and fill their stockings. And for him not to be there on Christmas morning to see them open their presents filled him with a sense of gloom. On the other hand, this was a murder case, and Sid Kelton had been a relatively wealthy and important man, a man of considerable property. They couldn't just take the holiday time off without someone high up back at HQ having something unflattering to say about it. But Moulton, for once, surprised him. He hadn't missed the gloomy look his sergeant had given him, nor was he unaware of his duties. "My sergeant will be leaving," he said, with quiet authority. "But I myself will be staying." Ford smiled with relief, even as he felt a wave of guilt wash over him for all the times he'd mentally sworn at his superior or run him down. But, truth be told, Moulton wasn't making all that much of a sacrifice. All his children had grown up, and he knew his wife could easily go to their daughters for Christmas Day to save being alone. He asked Ford to tell her as much, and a few minutes later the sergeant left, restraining from whistling cheerfully until he was decently out of earshot of the farm. Jenny set to work on dinner. As she worked, though, her mind hummed. Delia had left the place that morning, expecting never to come back. No doubt she'd been smuggling out the odd item of clothing over the weeks and leaving them with Sissy to hide. And Sissy herself had been holding some money, no doubt from the housekeeping. But when Delia had arrived at the dell, all excitement and anticipation, it was only to learn that Cordelia had discovered the stash and confiscated it, no doubt thoroughly berating and demoralizing her daughter as she'd done so. So Delia would be on her own if she left. And worse even than that, alone and without money. She would have had no choice but to return home in defeat. So she'd have come back to the farm feeling thoroughly enraged, miserable and totally frustrated. And discovered her uncle, sitting at the table. Good old Sid, who was the real owner of the farm, but who lacked the will and backbone to stand up to her father. Sid, who must have had plenty of money of his own. Had he ever offered her any? Sid, frail and helpless, just sitting there, and perhaps smiling at her, totally unaware, and seemingly uncaring about the devastating blow she'd just been delivered. Jenny sighed heavily. It was possible that Delia could have exploded in a moment of madness. But was it likely? She didn't know. Not yet. She would try to get to know these people much better in the coming days, to talk to them and listen to them, and hope that one of them let something slip. One thing was for sure, she thought grimly. It was going to be a very strange Christmas, with a police inspector as a guest, and everyone watching everyone else and silently wondering, was it you? And for one of them, it would be the strangest Christmas of all, watching the policeman, waiting to see if he seemed to uncover any clue or any scrap of evidence, wondering if he, or she, had really got away with it. Chapter 8. Delia awoke on Christmas morning to the sound of church bells drifting across the valley. For a long moment she lay snug and safe in her warm bed, listening to the Westcott Barton church bells tinkling joyously in the clear frosty air. Her mind, for a moment, blissfully blank. It's Christmas, she thought then, still sluggish from sleep. And for a moment, everything was still all right. Then, like a cold wave suddenly breaking over her, she thought, London, and wanted to cry. Then, an even colder wave hit her, and she forgot all about her aborted dreams of escape, and she thought instead, Uncle Sid. Delia closed her pretty brown eyes for a long painful moment, and her hands curled into fists by her side. If only. She groaned and sat up, and immediately began shivering in the frozen air. She had let the fire go out before going to bed. Utterly surprising in the circumstances, and not for the first time, she swore bitterly to herself about the lack of central heating. The next time she was in town, she'd buy herself an electric fire for her bedroom, no matter how much her father moaned about the cost of power nowadays. Then, a spurt of defiance fizzled, as she realized that the cost of such appliances was bound to be expensive. She couldn't afford to squander even a single-pound coin. She quickly huddled into a tweed skirt that had belonged to her mother, and pulled on a blouse and pale blue sweater, which was now a shade too small for her. Goosebumps peppered her wrists as she rubbed her hands together for warmth and to stop her fingers tingling in the cold. She wondered yet again what sort of kink it was in her father's makeup that made him so penny-pinching when he was one of the wealthiest men around. Could he be mentally ill? She was just about to get up and make the bed when a small white packet propped on her dressing table caught her eye. She'd missed it yesterday, being too numb and shocked to notice anything much. Now she frowned and moved cautiously around the bed, her heart suddenly hammering in her chest. She felt suddenly deeply afraid, but couldn't have said why. She noticed her own name written on the front, and immediately recognized the handwriting. Sid's writing. With shaking hands, she reached for the packet, which felt as cold as pity in her hands, and fumbled with the sealed flap. But, nightmarishly, it seemed to resist her probing fingers, and in the end, she angrily pulled the top off in a sudden jerk, dropping it onto the floor as the thing came apart in her hands. An explosion of 20-pound notes fluttered in the air, and landed on the thin, faded carpet. For a long moment, Delia simply stared down at the money. Then, like a wondrous child, she bent and carefully collected them all together. There was £1,500 worth of them when she'd finished counting, which was more than enough to get her to London. She could even rent a little bedsit while she hunted about for a job. She could also take Sissy. But why had Sid done this now? Suddenly, feverishly, Delia grabbed for the envelope and looked inside. Then she froze as she saw a slim, singly folded piece of paper tucked inside, and licked her painfully dry lips. For a moment, a mad, near hysterical moment, she wanted to tear the letter into shreds before she could read it. But the moment passed quickly. She simply had to know. Slowly, she extracted the note and read the few brief words written on one side. My dear Delia, Happy Christmas, my beloved niece. I hope you find the life you've always wanted, beloved niece. I hope you find the life you've always wanted and love what you find. Your loving Uncle Sidney. For a long moment, Delia stared at the words, as if unable to comprehend them. But slowly, very slowly, several things became horribly clear. Sid had known, must have always known, that she intended to leave the farm and soon, and that he'd always intended to help her. He'd left it until Christmas Day to tell her so. Left it until she was 18 and could legally act however she liked. He'd left it too late, Delia whispered, and 2 large tears rolled down her cheeks. Oh, Uncle Sid, she whispered, her words bouncing off the walls of her room and coming back to her, deepening her grief. Why did you leave it until it was all too late? Bert Kelton paused as the first church bells of the morning pealed across the valley, and looked instinctively towards the village. There, through the bare skeletons of trees, he could just make out the spire of the church, and a flock of rooks filling the bare branches of the ash tree beside it. He turned his back on the sight, and made off quickly in the opposite direction, ignoring the bite of fierce frost on his bare hands. He glanced down fondly at the dog trotting in resigned misery beside him. Sid's dog, really, Bert thought. Sid was the one who kept him hidden under the kitchen table. Then was the time when Bert had to come in and hoist the dog out of the kitchen before his father got home, knowing that Stan would give the dog a kick in the ribs for daring to come inside. He could still see Sid's eyes twinkling at him in silent gratitude. Could still see his uncle's old and ill face crack into a smile as he watched Bert drag the reluctant mutt out into the yard. Come on, Pooch, cheer up, he muttered. We have to round the sheep up out of Dingle Field. If the thaw comes, the meadow's bound to flood. He didn't, of course, have to do it on Christmas morning. Neither did he have to do it alone. But he couldn't face his first Christmas without Janice being there to wish him a Merry Christmas, with a laugh and a hug and a kiss under the mistletoe. Beside him, the dog heaved a great shuddering sigh, as if he'd understood every word and wasn't looking forward to it. The sound distracted Bert, who glanced down in the dog's direction once more and gave a dry, painful laugh. You're the only sheepdog I ever knew who didn't like sheep, he said, and instantly Sid's ghost was beside him. Ah, but that's what makes the hound so interesting, Sid had said, when Bert had first told him about the young pup's aversion to farm work. Bert almost glanced around, as if expecting to see Sid's ghost walking beside him, but resisted the impulse with gritted teeth. Instead, he frowned and put his best foot forward, intent on putting as much distance as he could between himself and the farm. He knew, one day, he simply wouldn't be able to go back. Every day, he had to fight an ever stronger urge to just turn his back and walk away. Only the fact that he didn't know where Janice was stopped him. Unless he stayed and managed to intercept any letter from her before his father got to it, he'd never know where she was. He didn't even want to think about what he would do if she ever stopped writing. If she finally believed he didn't want to know her, talk to her, be with her. If that happened, he thought, he could kill. "Damn it, Sid. It was all your fault," he said aloud, making the dog look up at him, one ear cocked inquisitively. Bert rubbed a hard hand over his brow and sighed deeply. "If only you'd kicked him off the farm years ago, none of this would have happened. I'd still have Janice." But Sid hadn't acted, and now Sid was dead. In the meadow, Bert surveyed the sheep, which were huddled all along one hedge, away from the wind and nestling in the lee. The snow was barely on the ground there, and they would be reluctant to ply their way through the deepening snow towards the gate. He glanced down at the dog, which was watching the sheep with misery in his soft brown eyes. "Off you go then," Bert gave the command, and the dog began crossing the field obediently, forced to make his way through the snow in leaps and bounds, rather than in a straight walking line. Bert moved around the field to check out the spot where the wind, sweeping in from the east, had cut a shallow path in the snow. With a few sharp whistles, the dog had them heading that way. Pooch was puzzled. He knew from past memory that the sheep had to go through the gate, so why was his master giving him commands to take them somewhere else? Then the snow under his paws became less steep, and he understood. Perhaps this wasn't going to be so bad after all. He began to punt happily, pressing his belly into the ground, watching, turning back, rounding up silly white objects that didn't seem to have a brain in their woolly heads. Then he heard a sharp whistle command that warned of a stray, saw one stupid ewe heading off on her own, and went after her. He nipped at her heels, never, of course, actually touching her. The stupid sheep bleated, skidded to a halt, and turned. And suddenly, the world fell out from under him. Pooch gave a single yip of surprise. He had not forgotten that there was a pond in this field, but the mutt simply hadn't known where it was, under all the whiteness that surrounded him. Now, terrifyingly, his rear end was immersed in cold, stinging water, and the dog gave a terrified yelp. He stared at the stupid, woolly-headed ewe that was trotting away and joining the others as if it hadn't a care in the world, and let out another heart-rending yelp as he felt his front paws sliding back on the ice. Desperately, he scrambled with his front paws, trying to dig them in, but he could get no purchase on the ice. His back legs doggy-paddled in the freezing water and scrambled vainly for a foothold. He was in the pond from his back legs to halfway up his spine now, and he lifted his head and howled. The mutt could feel the heat draining out of him, and he looked across to where his master was. But his master wasn't there. The dog whimpered. He hated being alone. He remembered the kind hand of his older master on his head, and wondered where he was. He wanted to be by the fire, and the big human female that had come to his home recently now regularly gave him scraps of meat. He liked her. He didn't like it when there wasn't a human around. He howled for his master, scrambling in the ice, but sinking in ever deeper. He was in almost to his shoulders now, and then, suddenly, the most wonderful sound he'd ever heard in all his canine life came from right behind him. "All right, Pooch. Hold on, boy." The dog turned his head and saw his master lying flat on his stomach, one large beefy hand reaching out to him, fingers curled around the scruff of his neck, hurting him, but Pooch didn't even whimper as Bert carefully pulled the dog from the icy pond. Pooch trustingly let go of his claw hold on the ice, allowing himself to be totally submerged for an instant before Bert could pull him clear. Bert wriggled back cautiously, very much aware that he couldn't tell how far out on the pond he was. For a long while, he wriggled carefully backwards, displaying his body weight as best he could, and pulling the unresisting shivering mutt with him. Only when he was sure he was clear of the pond did he sit up and drag the shaking dog onto his lap, wrapping his arms around the dog, rubbing warmth back into his quaking furry body. He'd heard the ice crack a split second before he'd seen the dog slip in, and his heart had almost stopped. Unlike the dog, he had forgotten about the pond, his mind being on other things. If the dog, Sid's dog, had died because of his stupidity, Sid's dog, had died because of his stupidity, he wasn't sure what he'd have done. "I'm sorry, Sid," Bert said, and found himself foolishly hugging the dog to his chest, crying all over it like a baby. "Oh, Sid, I'm so sorry." Bert Kelton's shoulders shook as he sobbed like a man finally broken. Relieved to be out of the cold, and so glad to be held in human arms again, Pooch reached up and began to lick his master's face, tasting strange salty water. He wondered if his other master would give him a biscuit when he got home. Pooch felt as if he deserved one. He didn't understand yet that his older master would never give him a biscuit again. At the farm, Jenny put the goose in to cook and looked up as the door from the hallway opened. The first one down this Christmas morning was not Stan, as she'd expected, but Bill. He walked in, looking like a man who'd spent the night tossing and turning. His hair was rumpled, his skin tight, and his blue eyes blazed in dry, red-rimmed anger. But it was a vague, undirected anger, and all the more debilitating for it. "Do you want bacon and eggs?" she asked him softly, able only to offer him food, when what he so obviously needed was something far more precious. He was not surprised when he shook his head. He stood staring around him, looking lost. He was a handsome man, Jenny thought, with a slight awakening of interest. She knew he was away into his 30s. Why wasn't he married? "I'll get you some tea," she said. "Nobody else is dying yet, but I thought I heard the door go just before I got up." She kept her voice deliberately casual, deliberately normal. "That was Bert," Bill said. "I saw him leave about 6. It was still dark at 6, Jenny thought, frowning. What could you do on a farm in pitch darkness? She poured the tea, handed him a mug, heard the creaking movements of someone walking about overhead, and put the bacon on to fry. It was Inspector Moulton, who put in an appearance a few moments later, his nose twitching. Still no Stan, she thought, and repressed an uneasy shiver. He'd be down in a minute. There really was no need for her to worry about a second murder, she told herself firmly. She was just being jumpy, that was all. "I don't know what we're going to do without Sid to keep our spirits going," Bill said at last, finally confronting his demons and ignoring the policeman altogether. But that probably had more to do with exhaustion, the cook thought charitably, than bad manners. Bolton glanced at Bill thoughtfully. The younger son, so he wouldn't be inheriting the farm. Unmarried too, as he recalled. "Tell me, Mr. Kelton, why do you stay on here, if you dislike it so much?" Jenny had filled him in on the family's complex and, in her opinion, downright unhealthy relationships last night, and he was frankly curious about Bill Kelton. "Delia, as a young girl, I have no choice but to stay there. She had no money, and Moulton was of the firm opinion that, even in this day and age, it was better for daughters to stay in the protection of a family unit until they got married. And Bert Kelton would one day inherit the farm, as would his son Jeremy after him, so he didn't question their allegiance to it. But Bill Kelton would not inherit. Bill Kelton worked long hours, for probably small rewards. He was also a bachelor, and yet he was a handsome enough man. Oh yes, Moulton wondered very much about Bill Kelton. Bill looked across at him now and gave a weary, pitying smile at how little strangers could understand. "I'm a Kelton," he said, as if that explained everything. "I can't get away from here any more than Bert can, or Delia." He reached for his mug of tea, as though it was a hefty shot of whiskey, and gulped it down. Indeed, he almost sounded like a drunken man, and yet he was terrifyingly sober. "Merry Christmas," he said softly, and began to laugh. Jenny stiffened. Enough of that. Hysteria on Christmas morning was more than she had bargained for. "Mr. Kelton," she began, her voice hard and bracing, "I think—" "I don't pay you to think, Miss Starling." Stan Kelton's voice boomed across the room, making Moulton jump and spill his tea. "I pay you to cook." He glanced at the stove. "I'm crisply frying bacon." He nodded, walked to the table, poured a mug of tea, and sat at the head, ignoring his son, who stared blankly at the wall. Moulton glanced at Jenny and nodded thoughtfully. He thought she'd been exaggerating the family tensions when she talked to him last night. Now, though, he could see for himself what she meant. The very air around them seemed to be bubbling. The whole place had the feel of a pressure cooker about to explode at any moment. And yet, surely, Moulton thought with a frown, it had already done so. Sidney Kelton had been murdered after all. Yet Stan Kelton was a presence that nobody could ignore. Even now, Sid was fading as if he'd never been, like an old sepia photograph that had been left out too long in the sunlight. Even Moulton felt the blast of this man's powerful personality and had to stiffen his backbone against it. "Mr. Kelton," he said firmly, "I wondered if we might go over some old family history," he asked, meeting Stan's eyes with his usual deceivingly level look. "I need to know as much about Sidney as I can learn." Stan scowled and shrugged. "Don't see what good that'll do," he grunted, but lumbered to his feet. "I'll go look out all the family papers and the album. We can go over them after breakfast." Delia didn't come down for breakfast, and Jeremy found the kitchen deserted when he walked in half an hour later. There were dirty plates in the sink, so he knew that the others had been and gone, but he couldn't bring himself to care where everyone was. He felt as if he were the only one left on the face of the planet. Never had he felt so lonely or so guilty. If only he hadn't quarreled with his uncle. If only he'd listened more carefully to what he'd been trying to tell him. He helped himself to some of the bacon in the frying pan, put it between 2 slices of freshly baked bread, added a dollop of brown sauce, then sat at the empty table, unable to eat it. Instead, he found himself staring at the chair where his Uncle Sid had been sitting yesterday, a knife buried in his chest, his eyes wide open, looking at him accusingly. Bill pulled his scarf tighter around his chin as he looked out across the village. He had left the others in the living room to discuss the precious Kelton family history, mumbling some excuse about going to find Bert. No one had objected to him leaving, although that strangely sexy-looking cook had given him a searching look. The truth was, Bill simply could not bear to be in his father's company a moment longer than necessary. For as long as he could remember, poor Bert had been the slow one, the clumsy one, the useless one, and he, Bill, had been the brains and the firm favorite. Then, suddenly, over the last month or so, his father's ire had turned for some reason against him, until he was convinced that his father actively hated him. Not that that wasn't fine with Bill. In fact, in many ways it was something of a relief. For Bill could not remember a time when he had ever loved his father, and now he no longer had to feel guilty about it. As he stood out in the cold, He wondered where Bert was. He wondered how Delia was. He wondered if Jeremy would be the first Kelton to escape Stan Kelton and the curse of Kelton Farm. He didn't wonder about Sid. He didn't even want to think about Sid. In the living room, Jenny, Moulton and Stan sat around the fire, the Kelton papers spread out on the table around them. "So, where do I start?" Stan said, then carried on before Moulton could reply. "Well, Sid was born in May 1940, and I was born a year later." He sorted through the album and picked out their baby pictures. Even as chubby infants, Stan had looked the stronger, the bigger, the one who frowned, while Sid was the baby who chuckled. "When I was 22, I married Eloise when she was just 16. Stan continued, and once more hunted through the album until he came to the only colored photograph in it. It was an expensive studio shot of a beautiful young woman with long, fair, wavy hair and the deepest velvet brown eyes Jenny had ever seen. In 1964, we had Bert. "You were living here, then," Moulton put in, not bothering to point out that Stan Kelton was dwelling on his life, not on that of his brothers. Stan nodded, looking surprised. "Of course. Where else?" Moulton nodded. "Go on." "Well, Sid had a really bad bout of illness many years ago. Asthma, pleurisy, pneumonia, you name it. When he came out of hospital, well," he shrugged helplessly, "he was just buggered." Stan paused, as if about to say something else, then merely sighed. "In 74, Bill was born, and Delia, a long while after that. Eloise died giving birth to our daughter," he said bluntly. "Probably at her too late in life." He didn't sound particularly regretful, angry, or even much interested. Not now, anyway. Jenny's eye fell to the portrait of the beautiful Eloise and wondered, had Stan Kelton ever loved his wife? She had certainly been lovely enough, but somehow she couldn't quite accept that looks alone had been reason enough for Stan to marry her. Stan, who according to his own daughter, always got what he wanted. "Eloise," Jenny said carefully, "was she, did she come from a wealthy family?" she asked, as delicately as she could. Stan looked at her, and then grunted a brief, hard laugh. "Not particularly, no. She lived in the village. Her father owned a butcher's shop." "Oh," Jenny said, genuinely surprised. Perhaps, after all, Stan Kelton had married for love. But she still somehow doubted it. Oh yes, she doubted it very much. "And what happened to Sid all this time?" Moulton asked, curious in spite of himself. Stan shrugged. "Sid came to look upon my family as his own. He treated them like his own kids. He never, Moulton took a breath, found any companionship from a lady himself." Stan grunted. "Like I said, Sid came home from hospital a different man. He was always sickly. Couldn't walk far without wheezing. Couldn't do any of the heavy work. Didn't seem to bother the ladies much either. And over the years..." Stan shrugged. "Yes," Jenny thought grimly. "Over the years you just took over. And Sid let you. But why?" Granted, Sid wasn't as naturally aggressive as his brother, but he had been a younger man then. Still, losing his health could have been traumatic for him. Yes, that could affect a man very badly, especially a previously fit one, a man who relied on physical strength and stamina to do his job and run the family farm. And yet, Jenny sighed, sure that there was more to all of this than Stan would have them believe. It just didn't make sense. Something was missing. She couldn't help feeling that a vital part of the jigsaw was being kept back from them. Moulton thanked Stan stiffly, and the farmer grunted, getting to his feet, not liking to be so obviously dismissed. But for once, disinclined to make an issue out of it. "I suppose we better get together around the tree and open the presents," he said, and shook his head. "Don't feel much like it, though," he muttered, and glanced quickly down at them, as if daring them to comment, as if showing even a glimmer of humanity was something to be ashamed of, guarded against. Wisely, they said nothing, but both of them watched him thoughtfully as he walked away. "A strange man, that," Bolton said at last. Jenny murmured. She was thinking not of Stan, but of Sid. And the more she thought of Sid, the more her eyes were drawn to the photograph of his lovely sister-in-law Eloise. She of the lovely dark eyes. What secrets, Jenny wondered, had she taken with her to her grave? Chapter 9. Jenny bent over the half-cooked goose and gave it a thorough basting. One of the many good things to be said about goose, she thought with immense satisfaction, was that there was always plenty of fat in the bottom of the pan. It was never going to go dry, unlike turkey, which could be a bit tricky. And goose fat made the best roast potatoes ever. The smell of the onions roasting on either side of the bird filled the air with that particularly mouth-watering phenomenon that cooking onions always produced. But unfortunately, there was no one else around to fully appreciate it with her. She checked to make sure that her stuffing of sage, onion, stewed apple, herb, sausage, celery, and sweet chestnut was still firmly packed deep inside the bird, and nodded, well satisfied to see that it was. She didn't really mind the fact that the family had been avoiding the kitchen all that morning. On the contrary, it gave her some desperately needed time to think. Someone had turned a radio on at breakfast, and now a church service from Oxford Cathedral, in the heart of Christ Church College, came clearly across the airwaves. A poignantly sweet rendition of Silent Night by the Christ Church choristers helped to dispel the gloom that hung over Kelton Farm. She set to on the potatoes with gusto. It was simply impossible, in Jenny's view, to have too many roast potatoes. She jumped when the door from the hallway opened, but it was only Moulton. "They're all still huddled in the living room," he said gloomily, by way of greeting. The cook said enigmatically. "That eldest lad, Bert, he came back an hour ago, soaked through and shivering fit to shift the rafters. Says he had to go in a pond after that dumb mutt of theirs." Jenny repeated. Moulton sat down at the chair, very carefully not choosing the chair that the late Sid Kelton had frequented, and reached for the perpetually filled teapot. "Well, I did ask to be filled in on the family background," Moulton sighed, "and I got it, in spades. I've heard all about poor old Sid's great hospital stay, and all about how the oldest Kelton male, whether legitimate or not, has to inherit. I was even given the opportunity to go over the farm's accounts for the last 2 decades, if I wanted. I declined. I think they had it in their heads that I suspected the deceased of committing some sort of financial jiggery-pokery. Not that I'd be able to tell if he had mind. We have forensic accountants for that sort of thing," Moulton explained, with just a hint of pride. "But from what I can tell, I think the Keltons are doing very well for themselves. Very well indeed. Which is odd, when you consider how they live. You'd think none of them had a penny to rub together." Jenny sighed. "Keeping a tight hold on the purse strings is just one of the ways Stan keeps them all in line," she explained flatly. "You'd think at least one of them would have the gumption to stand up for themselves." Jenny said, obviously on a roll. Moulton sighed heavily. "I do think you could be a bit more helpful, Miss Oh-so-clever-dick Starling," the policeman protested mildly, then added casually, "After all, I can't give my permission for you to leave the farm until after it's all sorted out." Jenny said, but this time with much more feeling. Moulton glanced at her, totally surprised that his none-too-veiled threat hadn't, at the very